The words left Corin's mouth before Lila could even brace herself. I reject you, Lila Marsh, as my fated mate. The clearing went silent. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder under the full moon, their breath fogging in the cold air, and every single one of them turned to look at her. Lila felt her knees weaken. The bond that had lived quietly in her chest for the past 3 years, the thread that connected her to Corin since the day they turned 16, snapped in an instant. It did not break slowly. It shattered, sharp and sudden, like glass dropped on stone. She staggered back a step. Her wolf let out a sound inside her mind, a whimper so raw it made her stomach turn. Rejection was not just words. It was a wound that cut through both body and spirit, a pain that every wolf in the Ashwood pack understood, because every wolf feared it. Corin, she whispered, though she already knew there was nothing left to say. He did not look at her with regret. He looked at her the way someone looks at a burden they were finally free of. You are not what a future alpha needs beside him, he said, loud enough for the entire pack to hear. You are weak. Your wolf barely shows itself. I need a mate who can stand at my side when I lead this pack, not one who hides in the shadows. Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd. Not everyone laughed. Some looked away in discomfort, unable to watch a rejection performed so publicly, so cruelly, in front of the whole pack instead of in private the way tradition usually allowed. But enough people laughed that the sound of it dug into Lila's chest, deeper than the bond breaking ever could. She had known, for weeks, that something was wrong. Corin had grown distant. He had stopped meeting her eyes during pack dinners. He had made excuses to avoid training beside her. She had told herself it was stress, the pressure of preparing to take over as Beta once his father stepped down. She had told herself many things to avoid the truth that stood in front of her now, spoken aloud for the entire world to witness. Grace, her closest friend since childhood, pushed through the crowd and grabbed Lila's arm. Don't listen to him, Grace hissed under her breath. He is a coward for doing this here, in front of everyone. But the damage was already done. A public rejection was rare. It was almost never chosen, because it humiliated not just the one being rejected, but the entire family standing behind her. Lila could feel her father's gaze from somewhere in the crowd, could feel the shame radiating off him even without turning to look. Her mother had passed 3 winters ago, and Lila was grateful, in this single terrible moment, that she was not alive to see her daughter cast aside like this. You should go, Corin said, his voice flat now, as if he had already spent all his cruelty and had nothing left but indifference. There is no place for you here anymore. Lila opened her mouth. She wanted to say something that would make him feel even a fraction of what she felt. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation that made sense, to ask him why he had waited until the whole pack gathered for the moon ceremony to do this, instead of telling her in private weeks ago. But no words came. Her throat had closed around the pain, and all she could do was turn away from him, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in front of so many watching eyes. She pushed past Grace, past the elders standing near the ceremonial fire, past pack members who stepped aside to let her through, some with pity in their eyes, others with the same cold amusement Corin had shown. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she needed to be away from all of it, away from the circle of firelight, away from the pack that had just watched her be discarded like something broken beyond repair. She made it only a few steps past the edge of the crowd when the air itself seemed to change. It was not something she could explain later, not fully. A pressure settled over the clearing, heavy and undeniable, the kind of weight that made every hair on her arms rise. The wind stilled. Even the fire crackling in the center of the gathering seemed to dim, as if it, too, understood something powerful had arrived. Then came the growl. It was not loud in the way a shout is loud. It did not need volume to command attention. It rolled through the clearing low and deep, vibrating through the ground itself, and every single wolf present, without exception, dropped to one knee. Lila froze. She had never felt anything like it before. Her own wolf, still whimpering from the rejection only moments earlier, went utterly still inside her, as if listening to something ancient calling out to it. She turned, slowly, along with everyone else, toward the source of the sound. A man stood at the edge of the clearing where the trees opened into the ceremonial ground. He wore no crown, no obvious symbol of rank, yet something about the way he stood, the way the moonlight seemed to gather around him rather than simply fall on him, told Lila exactly who he was before anyone spoke his name. The Alpha King, someone whispered from the crowd, and the words spread through the gathering like fire catching dry grass. Damian Cross, ruler of all 12 packs, a man whose name was spoken in every pack meeting. whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands of wolves who had never even seen his face. He rarely traveled to smaller packs like Ashwood. His presence here, tonight, unannounced, was already enough to send a wave of confusion and fear through the crowd. But it was not fear that held Lila in place. It was something else entirely, something that started as a flicker deep in her chest and grew, within seconds, into a roaring warmth that spread through her entire body. Her broken bond, still raw and aching from Corin's rejection, seemed to reach for something new, something that answered back instantly, without hesitation. Damien's eyes found hers across the clearing, and the moment their gazes locked, Lila felt the world tilt beneath her feet. He went rigid. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had just been struck by something he could not control. His wolf, powerful enough to command entire packs into submission with a single sound, seemed to surge forward inside him, desperate and insistent. "Mate," he said, the word barely audible, and yet it carried across the silent clearing as if he had shouted it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lila heard her own name whispered, heard Corin's name spoken with confusion, and then with dawning horror as pack members began to understand what had just happened. The Omega who had been rejected only moments ago, in front of the entire pack, was the fated mate of the most powerful wolf in the world. Lila did not move. She could not. Her mind struggled to catch up with what her body already understood on some deeper level, a level beyond thought. The bond that had just formed was nothing like the quiet, steady thread she had shared with Corin. This was overwhelming. It filled every corner of her being, demanding acknowledgement, demanding to be recognized. Corin's face had gone pale. He stared at Damien, then at Lila, then back at Damien again, as if trying to convince himself that this was some kind of mistake. "That is impossible," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "She is nothing. She has no standing, no strength, nothing that would draw the attention of the Alpha King." Damien's head snapped toward him, and the growl that followed made several wolves nearby flinch and lower their heads even further. "Careful," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous. "How you speak of my mate." The word hung in the air. My mate. Not a possibility, not a rumor to be confirmed later. A declaration, spoken with the full authority of a king who did not make mistakes about matters as sacred as this. Lila's legs finally remembered how to move, though she was not sure if she stepped forward or if the ground itself seemed to shift beneath her, pulling her closer to the man who had just upended everything she thought she understood about her place in the world. Moments ago she had been discarded, humiliated, in front of everyone she had ever known. Now the same crowd stared at her, with an entirely different kind of shock, as if she had transformed into someone unrecognizable, simply by standing still. She did not feel transformed. She felt exactly the same, wounded and uncertain, except now there was this new presence pulling at her, insistent and warm, refusing to let the pain of rejection settle fully into her bones. Grace appeared at her side again, gripping her hand this time instead of her arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Lila," she breathed, "do you understand what just happened?" Lila shook her head slowly. She did not understand. Not yet. All she knew was that the space where Corin's bond used to sit, now empty and aching, had found something new to hold on to, something that felt both terrifying and impossible to ignore. Damien began to walk toward her, each step deliberate, unhurried, as if the entire clearing existed only for the two of them now. Pack members parted to let him through without needing to be told, their heads still bowed, their eyes flicking nervously between their king and the woman he had just claimed in front of all of them. Lila's heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone nearby could hear it. She had walked into this ceremony expecting to be formally recognized as Corin's mate before the pack. She had walked into it already knowing, somewhere in her heart, that something had gone wrong between them. She had never, in her wildest imagination, expected to walk out of it as the fated mate of the Alpha King. As Damien closed the distance between them, the pull in her chest grew stronger, undeniable, and Lila realized, with a mixture of fear and something she could not yet name, that her entire life was about to change in ways she had no way of preparing for. Behind her, whispers spread through the crowd like ripples across still water. Elder Arthur, the oldest wolf in Ashwood Pack, leaned toward the woman beside him and murmured something Lila could not hear, though the shock on both their faces told her enough. Never in living memory had a rejected mate found a new bond within moments of the first one breaking. Fated bonds were rare enough as it was. For one to form in front of an entire pack, in the exact instant a rejection had just torn through another, Felt like something out of the old stories the elders used to tell around winter fires, tales meant to teach lessons rather than describe anything that could actually happen. Corin had not moved from where he stood. His eyes darted from Damien to Lila and back again, and Lila could see the calculations running behind his gaze, the sudden and desperate attempt to understand how the Omega he had just humiliated in front of everyone had become, within seconds, the most important woman in the entire wolf world. His hands, which had been steady and certain only minutes ago as he delivered his rejection, now trembled slightly at his sides. "This changes nothing," Corin said, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the panic underneath his attempt at composure. "I already released her. The bond between us is finished." "Good," Damien said without breaking his stride toward Lila. "Because if it were not, I would be forced to challenge you for her, and I do not think you would survive that conversation." The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for the weight of it to settle over the clearing. This was not an idle warning. Everyone present understood that the Alpha King did not make threats he was unwilling to follow through on, and the casual certainty in his voice made it clear that Corin's life, had things gone differently only moments earlier, would have hung by nothing more than the thinnest thread. Lila's mind raced, trying to keep pace with everything unfolding around her. An hour ago she had prepared herself for a formal mating ceremony beside Corin, expecting to spend the rest of her life as the mate of a future beta in a pack she had known her entire life. Now she stood rooted to the spot while the most powerful wolf in existence walked toward her with an intensity that made her chest ache in ways rejection never had. She wanted to run. Some small, frightened part of her wanted to turn and disappear into the trees, to escape the weight of every eye in the clearing now fixed on her, to avoid whatever came next, simply because she did not know if she could survive another moment of being the center of attention, after already surviving the worst moment of her life only minutes before. But her feet would not obey that instinct. The bond pulling her toward Damien was stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion, stronger than the humiliation still burning beneath her skin. Grace squeezed her hand one final time before letting go, stepping back to give Lila space, though the worry in her friend's eyes did not fade. "Whatever happens," Grace whispered, "you are not alone in this." Lila appreciated the words, even if she could not fully absorb them in the moment. Her entire focus had narrowed to the man now standing only a few steps away from her, close enough that she could see the intensity in his expression, the way his jaw remained tight as though he too were struggling to process the sudden and irreversible shift that had just occurred in both their lives. The clearing had gone utterly silent again, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the trees. Every wolf present, whether kneeling still or slowly rising back to their feet, watched the space between Lila and Damien with breathless anticipation, waiting to see what the Alpha King would do next, waiting to understand exactly what this unprecedented moment meant for all of them. Lila lifted her chin, refusing to let herself shrink beneath the weight of so many watching eyes, refusing to let the shame of rejection define whatever came next. Whatever this man wanted, whatever this bond demanded of her, she would face it with whatever strength she had left after everything the night had already taken from her. Damien stopped less than an arm's length away, close enough now that Lila could feel warmth radiating from him despite the cold night air, close enough that the pull between them felt almost unbearable in its intensity. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the entire pack holding its breath around them, waiting to see what words could possibly follow a moment as strange and unexpected as this one. Then Damien slowly, deliberately, lowered himself down onto one knee before her, an act so far outside anything the gathered wolves had ever witnessed that a collective gasp rose from the crowd, loud enough to break the silence that had held the clearing captive since his arrival. No king had ever knelt before an Omega in the history of the 12 packs, and yet Damien Cross did exactly that, his knee pressing into the cold earth of the Ashwood clearing, while hundreds of wolves watched in stunned silence. Lila stared down at him, unable to fully process what she was seeing. Kings did not kneel, alphas did not lower themselves before anyone, let alone an Omega who had been publicly discarded only minutes earlier. Yet here he was, his head bowed slightly, his eyes never leaving hers, waiting for something she did not yet understand how to give. "Lila Marsh," Damien said, his voice carrying easily across the silent clearing. "The moon has chosen you as my fated mate. I claim you before this pack, before every witness gathered here tonight, and before the ancestors who watch over all of us." The words settled over the crowd like a verdict. Lila heard several sharp intakes of breath, heard someone near the back of the gathering whisper the word impossible, heard Corin's ragged exhale from somewhere behind her. None of it mattered as much as the storm of feeling rising inside her own chest, confusion tangled together with something that felt dangerously close to hope, a feeling she had not allowed herself in years. "I do not understand," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, though in the silence of the clearing it carried further than she expected. "This cannot be real. An hour ago I was nothing. I was rejected in front of everyone I have ever known." Damien rose to his feet slowly, closing the remaining distance between them until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You were never nothing," he said, his voice low, meant for her alone even though the entire pack strained to hear every word. "Whatever that man said to you, whatever he believed about your worth, it changes nothing about what the moon has decided. Fate does not make mistakes, Lila. It chose you. It chose us." She wanted to believe him. Some fractured part of her, the part still bleeding from Corin's rejection, wanted desperately to believe that this was not some cruel trick of circumstance, that the universe had not simply replaced one humiliation with another, more elaborate one. But years of being overlooked, years of being told her wolf was too quiet, too weak, too unremarkable to matter, had taught her to be cautious with hope. Why would the Alpha King's mate be an Omega from a small pack no one outside this territory has ever heard of? She asked, and though the question was meant for Damien, it seemed to hang in the air for the entire crowd to consider as well. Surely fate would choose someone stronger, someone worthy of standing beside a king. Something flickered across Damien's expression, an emotion she could not quite name, somewhere between frustration and tenderness. "Fate does not measure worth by strength," he said. "It measures something deeper, something none of us fully understand, not even kings. I do not know why the moon chose you. I only know that the moment I saw you, everything else in this world became background noise. That is not something I can explain away, and I would not want to even if I could." Corin, who had remained frozen at the edge of the clearing throughout this exchange, finally found his voice again, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but surely this requires further consideration." She has no training in matters of leadership, no experience with courtly affairs. To bring her into the Crimson Court as your mate would be. "Careful," Damien said again, and this time the warning in his voice carried an edge sharp enough to make Corin's mouth snap shut immediately. "You forfeited any right to speak on her behalf the moment you humiliated her in front of her entire pack. I suggest you use whatever wisdom you have left to remain silent." The elder standing near the ceremonial fire, an older woman Lila recognized as Beatrice, the pack's most respected healer, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty, if I may, this is an unprecedented situation, and the pack will need time to understand what has happened tonight. Perhaps." "There is nothing to understand beyond what has already been declared," Damien said, though his tone toward Beatrice was noticeably gentler than the one he had used with Corin. "Lila Marsh is my mate. She will return with me to the Crimson Court, where she will be treated with the honor and respect befitting her position, whether this pack chooses to acknowledge that respect or not." Lila's mind spun at the mention of leaving. She had lived her entire life within Ashwood territory, her father, her home, the few friendships she had managed to build despite years of quiet exclusion, all of it existed here, within these familiar trees and this familiar pack. The idea of leaving immediately, of stepping into a life at the Crimson Court, a place she had only ever heard described in stories about the king's power and reach, felt like being asked to leap off a cliff without knowing what waited below. "I need time," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice despite the chaos churning inside her. "This is too much, too fast. I cannot simply leave everything I know within the same night I have been rejected in front of all of them." Damien studied her for a long moment, and Lila braced herself for pushback, for the kind of authority that kings were known to wield without hesitation. Instead, something in his expression softened, just slightly, enough that she noticed it even in her exhausted and overwhelmed state. "You are right," he said. "I have asked too much of you too quickly, and that is unfair given everything you have already endured tonight. Take whatever time you need to gather your belongings, to say what you need to say to the people who matter to you here. I will wait." The offer surprised her, and judging by the murmurs rippling through the crowd, it surprised nearly everyone else as well. Kings did not typically wait. Kings commanded, and the world adjusted itself around their decisions. Yet here was Damien Cross, ruler of 12 packs, offering patience to an Omega he had known for less than an hour. Her father emerged from the crowd then, his face a complicated mixture of shock, pride, and lingering shame from the humiliation his daughter had suffered only minutes earlier. "Lila," he said quietly, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, "whatever you decide, I am with you." She looked at him, grateful for the small anchor of familiarity in a night that had upended everything she thought she understood about her place in the world. "I do not know what to decide," she admitted. "Everything happened so fast." "Then decide slowly," her father said. "No one can force you to choose faster than your heart is ready for. Not even a king." Damien, who had clearly overheard the exchange despite standing several feet away, nodded once in agreement, though Lila caught something like relief flash briefly across his features, as if he had feared she might refuse him outright, and was grateful for even this small acknowledgement that she was willing to consider the path forward. Grace appeared again, looping her arm through Lila's despite everything that had happened, despite the impossible circumstances surrounding them both. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you away from all these staring eyes for a moment. You need to breathe before you decide anything." Lila allowed herself to be led away from the clearing, away from Damien's steady gaze, away from Corin's pale and shaken expression, away from the crowd that had witnessed both her deepest humiliation and her most unexpected elevation within the same impossible hour. As they walked toward the edge of the trees, she could still feel the pull of the new bond stretching between herself and the king she had left standing in the clearing, a sensation she suspected would never fully fade now that it had taken root. "What are you going to do?" Grace asked once they were far enough from the gathering that their voices would not carry back to the crowd. Lila shook her head slowly, staring up at the moon that had apparently decided her fate without asking her opinion on the matter. "I do not know," she said honestly. "An hour ago I thought I understood my entire future. Now I do not understand anything at all." "Maybe that is not entirely a bad thing," Grace offered carefully. "Corin's future for you was rejection and humiliation. Whatever this new future holds, it cannot possibly be worse than that." Lila considered this, turning the words over in her mind as she looked back toward the clearing where Damien still stood waiting, exactly where she had left him, patient despite his position, despite his power, despite every reason he might have had to simply command her compliance, instead of offering her the courtesy of time. "No," she finally agreed, feeling something shift inside her chest, not quite hope yet, but perhaps the beginning of something that might grow into it given enough time. "It cannot possibly be worse." As she stood there beneath the moon that had rewritten her entire life within a single devastating and miraculous hour, Lila understood one thing with absolute clarity, even as everything else remained uncertain. Whatever waited for her at the Crimson Court, whatever challenges came with standing beside the most powerful wolf in the world, she would face them as someone new, someone the moon itself had deemed worthy, regardless of what Corin or anyone else in Ashwood Pack had once believed about her. The old Lila, the one who shrank from attention and accepted quiet humiliation as simply the shape of her life, had been left behind in that clearing along with the broken bond that no longer mattered. Whoever she became next, standing beside a king who had knelt before her in front of an entire pack, would have to be someone stronger. She returned to her father's house in a daze, moving through rooms that had held her entire childhood, gathering only what mattered most. A few pieces of clothing, a worn wooden pendant her mother had carved for her before she passed, shaped like a small crescent moon. A handful of letters from Grace written during the summers they had spent apart visiting distant relatives. Everything else, the furniture, the small trinkets collected over years, the quiet corners where she used to hide from a pack that never quite made room for her, she left behind without much hesitation. None of it had ever truly made her feel like she belonged anyway. Her father watched her pack in silence for a long while before finally speaking. "You do not have to go tonight," he said. "The king offered you time. You could wait until morning, until you have slept and thought this through properly." "I know," Lila said, folding the last of her clothes into a simple travel bag. "But if I wait until morning, I think I will convince myself to stay. And some part of me knows that staying here means staying small. Everyone in this pack has already decided who I am. I do not think that will change no matter how much time passes." Her father's expression softened with a sorrow he had clearly been carrying since Corin's rejection, perhaps even longer, since the years before that when he had watched his daughter overlooked again and again by a pack that valued strength and dominance over quiet resilience. "You were always more than they gave you credit for," he said. "I should have said that to you more often." "You do not need to apologize," Lila said, though her voice caught slightly on the words. "None of this was your fault." He pulled her into a brief, firm embrace before she could argue further. "Whatever happens at that court," he said, "remember that you carry Ashwood with you, even the parts of it that failed you. You carry your mother's strength too, whether you believe that about yourself yet or not." Grace waited outside when Lila finally emerged from the house, her travel bag slung over one shoulder, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and something she was almost afraid to call excitement. "Are you certain about this?" Grace asked one final time. "No," Lila admitted honestly, "but I do not think certainty is something I am going to get tonight, or maybe ever. I think I just have to walk forward and figure out the rest as it comes." They walked back toward the clearing together, where Damien still waited exactly as he had promised, along with a small group of his personal guard who had apparently arrived sometime during her absence, standing at a respectful distance from their king. When Damien saw her approaching, something shifted visibly in his posture, a tension she had not noticed before easing from his shoulders. "You came back," he said, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it, as though some part of him had genuinely feared she might not. "I did," Lila said simply, unsure of what else to add. Damien studied her for a long moment before nodding, as if satisfied by whatever he found in her expression. "Then let us go," he said. "The Crimson Court awaits, and there is much you deserve to know before we arrive." Lila glanced one final time toward the pack that had gathered to witness both her deepest humiliation and her impossible new beginning, toward Corin, who stood at the edge of the crowd looking smaller now than she had ever seen him, toward her father, who offered her a final steadying nod of encouragement. Then she turned away from Ashwood Pack, away from the only home she had ever known, and stepped forward into a future she could not yet fully imagine, walking beside a king whose fate had somehow, impossibly, become tangled with her own. The Crimson Court rose out of the mountains like something carved by giants, its towers catching the first light of dawn, as Lila's carriage crested the final ridge of the journey. She had imagined many things during the long ride from Ashwood territory, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer scale of the place she was about to call home. "It is a lot to take in," Damien said from beside her, watching her reaction carefully. "Most people who arrive here for the first time say the same thing." Lila said nothing, her eyes fixed on the sprawling fortress ahead, its walls a deep red stone that seemed to glow in the early morning light. Somewhere beyond those walls lived an entire court of nobles, advisors, and warriors who answered only to the man sitting beside her, and soon, apparently, to her as well. "I do not know how to be what they will expect of me," she finally admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "You do not have to be anything other than yourself," Damien said. "Though I understand that advice is easier given than followed." The carriage rolled through the front gates a short while later, and Lila found herself facing rows of guards and staff assembled to receive their king, all of whom turned their attention immediately to her the moment she stepped down from the carriage. She felt the weight of dozens of curious, assessing stares, each one clearly wondering the same question that had followed her since the moment Damien claimed her in front of the Ashwood Pack. How had an unremarkable Omega from a small territory become the fated mate of their king? A tall man with graying hair at his temples stepped forward first, offering a formal bow toward Damien before turning his attention to Lila. "Your Majesty," he said to Damien, "and Lady Marsh, I am Nathaniel, General of the King's forces and his closest advisor. Welcome to the Crimson Court." "Nathaniel has served my family since before I was born," Damien explained. "Whatever you need, he will see it handled." Nathaniel's eyes lingered on Lila, a moment longer than politeness strictly required, his expression carefully neutral, though Lila caught something guarded in his gaze that told her not everyone within these walls would welcome her arrival with open curiosity. Some, she suspected, would view her the same way Corin once had, as someone unworthy of standing beside power this significant. A woman emerged next from the main doors of the fortress, moving with brisk efficiency despite her evident age. "I am Clara," she introduced herself. "I manage the daily matters of the court. I will show you to your quarters, Lady Marsh, and help you settle before the formal introductions begin." "Formal introductions," Lila repeated, a flicker of dread rising in her chest. "The council will want to meet you properly," Damien explained gently. "It is tradition, though we can delay it if you need more time to adjust first." Lila appreciated the offer, though she suspected delaying the inevitable would only make it harder when the moment finally arrived. "No," she said, surprising herself with her own resolve. "Better to face it now than to spend days dreading it." Clara led her through corridors lined with tapestries depicting battles and ceremonies from centuries past rooms filled with staff who paused their work just long enough to steal glances at the new arrival before quickly returning to their tasks under Clara's watchful eye. Everything about the Crimson Court felt designed to overwhelm, from the towering ceilings to the sheer number of people moving through its halls with clear purpose, each of them seemingly more certain of their place here than Lila felt in her own skin. Her quarters, when they finally reached them, took her breath away despite everything else occupying her mind. The room was larger than her entire childhood home, furnished with a bed draped in deep blue fabric, a balcony overlooking mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and a wardrobe already stocked with clothing far finer than anything Lila had ever owned. "This is too much," she said quietly, running her fingers over the fabric of one of the dresses hanging inside the wardrobe. "It is simply what is expected for the king's mate," Clara said, though her tone carried no judgment, only practical efficiency. "You will grow accustomed to it faster than you think." Lila was not so certain of that, but she said nothing further as Clara helped her prepare for the introduction ceremony that would take place later that day. As she stood before a mirror taller than she was, dressed in clothing finer than anything she had ever worn, Lila barely recognized the reflection staring back at her. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who belonged in a place like this. Lila did not yet feel like that woman, no matter how convincing the reflection appeared. The council chamber, when she finally entered it hours later beside Damien, held perhaps 20 people seated around a long table, each of them representing different territories and interests across the 12 packs. Their eyes turned toward her in near-perfect unison, and Lila felt the same wave of scrutiny she had experienced upon arrival, magnified now by the formality of the setting. An older woman near the head of the table spoke first, her tone polite but pointed. "Lady Marsh, forgive my directness, but the council has many questions about how quickly this bond has been recognized. Fated mates are rare enough, but the speed with which you were brought here, without proper verification through the Elder Council, has raised concerns among several of us." "Victoria," Damien said, a note of warning in his voice, "the bond does not require verification from this council. It requires only the recognition of the wolves involved, which has already occurred." Victoria's gaze did not waver from Lila, despite Damien's interjection. "With respect, Your Majesty, the mate of a king carries responsibilities beyond simple bonding. She will need to understand court politics, diplomatic relations between packs, matters of law and governance. Does Lady Marsh possess any experience in these areas?" The question landed exactly as intended, a pointed reminder of everything Lila lacked, delivered with enough surface politeness that it could not easily be challenged as outright hostility. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, the old familiar sting of being reminded of her inadequacy. Except this time, the stakes felt infinitely higher than they ever had within Ashwood Pack. "I do not have that experience yet," Lila said before Damien could answer for her, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "But I am capable of learning, given the opportunity. I did not ask for this position, and I understand the concerns many of you likely have about my readiness. All I can offer is my willingness to prove myself, rather than simply demand acceptance based on a bond none of us fully chose." Silence settled over the chamber following her response, and Lila caught Damien's expression shifting beside her, something like surprised approval flickering across his features. Even Victoria seemed momentarily caught off guard by the directness of the answer, though she recovered quickly enough to offer a slight, measured nod. "A reasonable response," Victoria said, though her tone remained guarded. "We shall see whether your actions match your words in the coming weeks." The meeting continued for another hour, covering matters of territory disputes and upcoming diplomatic visits that meant little to Lila given her unfamiliarity with court affairs, though she forced herself to pay careful attention regardless, understanding that ignorance would only strengthen the doubts already circling around her. By the time the council finally dismissed, Lila felt utterly drained, as though she had fought a battle far more exhausting than any physical confrontation could have been. "You did well," Damien said once they were finally alone in the corridor outside the chamber. "Victoria is one of the more skeptical members of the council, but even she seemed impressed by your honesty." "It did not feel like doing well," Lila admitted. "It felt like drowning very slowly in front of an audience." Damien's expression softened, and for a moment the powerful commanding king faded slightly, replaced by someone who looked simply concerned for her well-being. "This will take time," he said. "I do not expect you to master court politics within a single day, and anyone who does expect that of you will answer to me." Lila appreciated the sentiment, though she suspected the weight of proving herself worthy would remain hers to carry regardless of Damien's protection. As they walked back through the fortress toward her new quarters, she caught sight of Corin's earlier words echoing faintly in her memory, his declaration that she was not what a future alpha needed beside him. She wondered, not for the first time since that devastating night, whether the council's skepticism was simply a more polished version of the same judgment, dressed in diplomatic language instead of cruel dismissal. That night, alone in her new quarters overlooking mountains she had never seen before this day, Lila allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not from despair, though exhaustion and uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of everything that had changed within the span of a single sunrise. She had lost the only home she had ever known and gained, in its place, a position she was not certain she deserved, standing beside a king whose bond to her remained the only certainty in an otherwise unfamiliar world. She thought of her father's words before she left, that she carried her mother's strength within her whether she believed it yet or not. She thought of Grace's steady support, of the promise to write once she settled into her new life, and beneath all of it, she felt the persistent, unshakable pull of the bond connecting her to Damien, a warmth that refused to fade no matter how overwhelmed the rest of her felt. Whatever doubts the council harbored, whatever skepticism awaited her in the days ahead, Lila resolved, staring out at unfamiliar mountains beneath an unfamiliar sky, that she would not shrink from this challenge the way she had once shrunk from Corin's quiet dismissals. She had been given an impossible second chance at a life entirely different from the one she had expected, and she intended to meet it with whatever courage she could summon from the wreckage of everything she had left behind. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts sometime later that evening. She wiped at her eyes quickly before answering, surprised to find Damien standing in the corridor, still dressed in the formal attire from the council meeting, though he had loosened the collar slightly, looking somehow more human in the low light of the hallway lanterns. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Clara mentioned you had not come down for the evening meal." "I was not very hungry," Lila admitted, stepping aside to let him enter, though she immediately wondered if that was appropriate given how little she understood of court customs. Damien did not enter fully, remaining near the threshold as though respecting a boundary she had not even thought to establish. "The council can be difficult," he said. "I should have warned you more thoroughly before throwing you into that meeting so soon after your arrival." "You did warn me," Lila said. "I do not think any amount of warning could have prepared me for Victoria's questions, though." A faint, tired smile crossed Damien's face. "Victoria questioned my own readiness to rule, for nearly a year after my father passed," he said. "She does not offer trust easily to anyone, myself included. If it helps at all, her skepticism is not personal to you specifically. It is simply how she operates." "It does help a little," Lila said, though the ache of the day's scrutiny had not fully faded. "I keep thinking about what Corin said, about me not being what a leader needs beside him. I know Victoria was not saying the same thing, not exactly, but it felt similar enough." Damien's expression shifted, something firmer settling into his features. "Corin was wrong," he said simply. "Not wrong in some diplomatic, careful way, wrong entirely. Whatever weakness he saw in you was never real. I felt it the moment our eyes met across that clearing. Something in you that most people spend their whole lives searching for and never find. I do not know how to explain it better than that." Lila studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any sign of performance, of a king simply saying comforting words because the situation demanded them. She found none, only quiet, unwavering certainty, the same certainty that had carried him across the clearing to kneel before her in front of an entire pack. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure of what else to offer in response to such conviction. "You do not need to thank me for stating a fact," Damien said. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight, at least, you have earned some peace." He left shortly after, and Lila closed the door behind him, standing alone once more in the vast, unfamiliar room that was somehow now her home. She thought about his words long after the fortress had gone quiet around her, about the certainty in his voice when he spoke of what he had felt the moment their eyes first met. Whatever waited for her in the days ahead, whatever battles the council and the wider court might still present, she found herself, for the first time since Corin's rejection, beginning to believe that perhaps she truly did belong somewhere after all. 3 weeks into her new life at the Crimson Court, Lila woke before dawn to the sound of shattering glass somewhere in the courtyard below her window. She rushed to the balcony, heart pounding, only to find a young servant girl sweeping up the pieces of a dropped vase, her expression apologetic toward a guard who had apparently startled her. Nothing was wrong. Nothing dangerous had occurred. Yet Lila's pulse continued to race for several minutes afterward, a lingering reminder of how quickly her nerves had become frayed since arriving at a place that still felt more like a beautiful cage than a home. She dressed slowly, taking in her reflection in the same tall mirror that had greeted her that first overwhelming day. The clothing fit her better now, tailored specifically to her measurements rather than borrowed from some general court supply, and her hair had been styled by Clara's staff in a way that made her look, at least on the surface, like someone who belonged among nobility. The reflection still felt like a costume some mornings, a disguise covering the same uncertain woman who had once been discarded in front of an entire pack. Breakfast that morning was a quiet affair, shared only with Damien in a smaller dining room reserved for the royal family, rather than the grand hall used for larger gatherings. He looked tired, dark circles forming beneath his eyes that had not been there during her first days at court. "You did not sleep well," Lila observed, pouring tea for them both, a small domestic gesture that had become one of the few comforts she allowed herself in this unfamiliar world. "Border disputes," Damien said simply, rubbing his temples. "Two of the smaller packs near the Eastern Territory have been raiding each other's hunting grounds. Nothing that requires my direct intervention yet, but enough to keep me awake reviewing reports." Lila nodded, though the details of pack politics still felt largely foreign to her despite weeks of study under Clara's patient tutoring. She had spent hours each day learning about territory boundaries, diplomatic protocols, and the complicated web of alliances that held the 12 packs together beneath Damien's rule. Progress felt slow, but Clara assured her it was steady. "Have you given any more thought to when you might want to hold your formal presentation to the wider court?" Damien asked, setting down his cup. "The council has been patient so far, but eventually the nobility beyond the immediate council will expect a proper introduction." Lila's stomach tightened at the thought. The council meeting had been difficult enough with its 20 or so members. A formal presentation to the wider court, potentially hundreds of nobles and representatives from across the 12 packs, felt like an entirely different scale of challenge. "I do not know if I am ready for that," she admitted. "You have more time," Damien assured her. "There is no rush, whatever pressure you might feel from certain corners of the council." She appreciated his patience, though she suspected the pressure would only continue mounting the longer she delayed. Some evenings, alone in her quarters, she found herself missing the simplicity of her old life in Ashwood, even with all its quiet humiliations. At least there, she had known exactly what was expected of her, even if what was expected amounted to very little. Here, the expectations felt vast and largely undefined, shifting depending on who she spoke with and what agenda they carried. Later that morning, during her lessons with Clara, a knock interrupted their session earlier than expected. Nathaniel entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim in a way that immediately set Lila on edge. "Forgive the interruption," he said, addressing Clara before turning his attention to Lila. "Lady Marsh, might I have a word with you privately?" Clara excused herself, leaving Lila alone with the general, whose careful neutrality toward her had softened somewhat over the past few weeks, though genuine warmth remained elusive between them. "There have been rumors circulating through the lower halls of the court," Nathaniel said once they were alone. "I thought it best you hear about them from me, rather than through whispers among the staff." "What kind of rumors?" Lila asked, bracing herself. "Word has reached us that your former packmate, the one who rejected you, has been in contact with representatives from a neighboring territory, Alpha Ronan, specifically, who leads the Thornfield pack." The name meant little to Lila initially, though she noted the tension in Nathaniel's jaw as he spoke it. "Should that concern me?" she asked. "Ronan has long harbored ambitions beyond his own territory," Nathaniel explained carefully. "He has challenged the king's authority in subtle ways for years, testing boundaries without ever crossing into outright rebellion. If he has found common cause with Corin, someone with personal grievance against you and, by extension, against the king's judgment in claiming you, it suggests they may be looking for ways to undermine your position here." Lila felt a chill settle over her despite the warm morning sunlight streaming through the study windows. What would they hope to accomplish by undermining me specifically? "If the court's mate can be discredited," Nathaniel said, "questions naturally follow about the king's judgment more broadly. It would not be the first time political rivals sought to weaken a ruler through his personal relationships, rather than direct confrontation." The information settled uneasily in Lila's chest for the remainder of the day. She said nothing to Damien that evening, uncertain whether raising the concern would help, or simply add to the burden he already carried with border disputes and council pressures. Instead, she threw herself further into her studies, determined to prove wrong anyone who doubted her position, whether their doubt came from simple skepticism or something more calculated and dangerous. Over the following days, small incidents began accumulating in ways that made Lila increasingly uneasy. A servant she had never met made a pointed comment about how quickly some people rise through circumstances they did not earn. A noble visiting from a distant territory asked probing questions about her family history during a formal dinner, questions that felt less like genuine curiosity and more like an attempt to find weaknesses to exploit. None of these moments amounted to anything overtly hostile on their own, but together they painted a picture of quiet, coordinated doubt spreading through the court, doubt that felt too consistent to be coincidental. "You have seemed distracted lately," Damien observed one evening as they walked together through the fortress gardens, one of the few activities Lila genuinely looked forward to each day, away from the formality of court life. She hesitated before answering, weighing whether to share what Nathaniel had told her. Eventually she decided honesty served her better than silent worry. "Nathaniel mentioned that Corin has been in contact with Alpha Ronan," she said. "He suggested they may be working together to undermine my position here." Damien's expression darkened immediately, though his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Ronan has tested my authority before," he said. "He is ambitious and patient, willing to wait years for opportunities to weaken my rule. If he has found an ally in Corin's bitterness, it complicates matters, but it does not change anything about your place here." "It might, though," Lila said quietly. "If enough people begin to doubt me, question whether I truly belong at your side, it could create exactly the kind of instability they are hoping for." Damien stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the flowering trees that lined the garden path. "Let them doubt," he said. "Doubt from cowards hiding behind rumors and manipulation means nothing next to the truth of what the moon itself has decided about us. I will not allow schemers to dictate how I treat my mate, and I do not believe, given what I have witnessed of your strength these past weeks, that you will allow them to dictate how you see yourself either." His confidence in her felt like a small, steady flame against the growing uncertainty pressing in from every direction. Lila wanted to believe his words fully, wanted to trust that whatever Corin and Ronan were planning would ultimately fail against the strength of the bond she shared with Damien. But some old, familiar fear lingered beneath her resolve, a fear built from years of being told she was not enough, that any success she achieved could be undone the moment someone with more power decided to challenge it. That night, sleep evaded her for hours as she lay awake, considering everything Nathaniel had shared. Whatever Corin and Ronan were plotting, she understood instinctively that it would not remain hidden in whispers and rumors indefinitely. Eventually, whatever scheme they were building would surface fully, and when it did, she would need to be ready to face it, not as the frightened, uncertain Omega who had arrived at the Crimson Court weeks earlier, but as someone capable of standing firm against whatever challenge came her way. She thought of her mother's crescent moon pendant resting on the table beside her bed, of her father's parting words about the strength she carried whether she recognized it yet or not. Whatever battle lay ahead, she resolved to meet it having learned something valuable from the humiliation that had first brought her to this place. She would never again allow anyone's judgment of her worth to determine her own sense of it, regardless of how many schemes Corin and Ronan might construct against her. A letter from Grace arrived the following morning, carried by one of the court's messengers who traveled regularly between the Crimson Court and the Outer Territories. Lila tore it open eagerly, grateful for a connection to the life she had left behind that did not come tangled with political scheming or courtly suspicion. Grace's words were warm and familiar, describing small details of life back in Ashwood, how her father had taken to spending more time helping with pack administrative duties since Lila's departure, how the pack had slowly stopped whispering about the ceremony, at least in public, though Grace suspected private gossip continued unabated. Near the end of the letter, Grace mentioned that Corin had left Ashwood territory entirely a week earlier, offering no explanation to the pack elders beyond needing time away to reflect. Lila read that particular line several times, understanding now, with Nathaniel's earlier warning fresh in her mind, exactly where Corin's reflection had likely taken him. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it away, deciding to mention this detail to Nathaniel later that day, confirmation that the concerning rumors held at least some grounding in fact. Her afternoon lessons with Clara shifted that day from diplomatic protocol to something Lila found unexpectedly engaging, an overview of the history of fated bonds throughout the 12 packs, meant to help her understand the significance others placed on what she and Damien shared. Fated bonds occur perhaps once in a generation across all 12 territories combined, Clara explained, spreading old texts across the study table. Most wolves never experience one at all, forming their bonds instead through choice and courtship. As your bond with Corin once was, a fated bond carries weight beyond simple attraction. Many believe it reflects some deeper alignment between two souls that transcends ordinary explanation. Is that why the council reacted so strongly? Lila asked. Because it happened so quickly, without the usual process of courtship or verification? Partly, Clara said. But also because fated bonds involving reigning monarchs are exceedingly rare in recorded history. The last documented case was nearly 200 years ago, during the reign of King Damien's great-great-grandfather. That bond, interestingly enough, also involved someone the wider court initially underestimated. This detail intrigued Lila enough that she asked Clara to elaborate further, and the older woman spent the remainder of their session describing the story of a young healer from a modest background who had become queen through a fated bond much like Lila's own, facing similar skepticism from the court, before eventually proving herself an invaluable advisor and leader in her own right. What happened to her? Lila asked. She ruled alongside her king for nearly 40 years, Clara said. Some records suggest she was more beloved by the common wolves across the territories than any monarch before or since, precisely because she understood struggles that most nobility never experienced firsthand. The story offered Lila a small measure of comfort, evidence that her current circumstances, however overwhelming, were not without precedent, that others who arrived at this court doubted and underestimated, had eventually found their footing and proven their worth beyond question. She thought about this story often over the following days, drawing quiet strength from it whenever the weight of council skepticism or whispered court gossip threatened to overwhelm her resolve. That evening, during a rare quiet moment before dinner, Lila noticed something strange happening within herself as she walked alone through the fortress gardens. Her wolf, which had remained unusually quiet since the trauma of Corin's rejection weeks earlier, stirred faintly beneath her skin, a sensation she had not felt with such clarity in longer than she could remember. It was subtle, barely perceptible, like a low hum beneath still water, but it was there, undeniable evidence that something within her had begun to shift since arriving at the Crimson Court. She mentioned this sensation to Damien later that night, uncertain what to make of it. His expression grew thoughtful, though he offered no immediate explanation. Fated bonds sometimes awaken dormant strength within a wolf, he said carefully. It is possible the bond between us is doing something similar for you, though I confess I do not fully understand the mechanics of it myself. Lila filed this observation away alongside everything else she had learned since arriving, another piece of a larger puzzle she suspected would only become clearer with time. Whatever Corin and Ronan were plotting in the shadows, whatever doubts continued circulating through certain corners of the court, she found herself increasingly certain that the answers to her own worth and capability lay not in proving herself according to others' expectations, but in discovering whatever strength had always existed quietly within her, waiting for the right circumstances to finally emerge. Deep within Thornfield territory, in a hunting lodge far from any prying eyes, Corin paced before a fireplace, while Alpha Ronan watched him with the patient amusement of a predator studying easy prey. "You are still angry," Ronan observed, swirling a cup of dark liquid in his hand. "Good. Anger is useful, provided it is aimed correctly." "She humiliated me," Corin snapped, though even as he said it, some distant part of him recognized the absurdity of the claim, given that he had been the one to deliver a public rejection in the first place. "The king made me look like a fool in front of my entire pack." "The king made himself look foolish," Ronan corrected smoothly, kneeling before an Omega from an insignificant territory, declaring her his mate with no verification, no ceremony befitting the position. "He has handed us an opportunity neither of us could have engineered ourselves, and all we need to do is make certain the rest of the 12 packs see the situation as clearly as we do." Corin stopped pacing, turning to face the older Alpha with cautious interest. "What exactly do you propose?" Ronan set down his cup, gesturing for Corin to sit across from him at the small table near the fire. "The council already harbors doubts about this girl's readiness," he said. "Doubts we can nurture and expand, given patience and the right whispers in the right ears. If we can demonstrate convincingly that she lacks the strength and capability the position demands, the council may be forced to challenge the king's judgment formally, perhaps even question his fitness to rule if he continues insisting on this bond despite mounting evidence of her unsuitability." "The king will not simply stand aside and allow that to happen," Corin said. "No," Ronan agreed, "but kings, however powerful, remain bound by the traditions and structures that grant them legitimacy in the first place. If enough of the 12 packs begin questioning his judgment, even his authority has limits. That is precisely why we must move carefully, methodically, ensuring that any doubts we plant appear to arise naturally rather than through obvious manipulation." Corin considered this, old resentment mixing uneasily with growing uncertainty about the scale of what Ronan was proposing. He had wanted revenge against Damien for humiliating him, had wanted to see Lila proven exactly as unworthy as he had once declared her to be. But the scope of Ronan's ambition, aimed not just at discrediting Lila but potentially destabilizing the king's entire rule, felt like something far larger and more dangerous than the personal grievance that had brought him here. "What do you actually want from all this?" Corin asked, voicing the question that had been forming since Ronan first invited him to this meeting weeks earlier. Ronan's expression sharpened slightly, the amusement fading into something colder and more calculated. "I want what should have been mine generations ago," he said. "My bloodline has ruled Thornfield territory longer than Damien's family has held the Crimson Court, yet ancient agreements placed his ancestors above mine in the hierarchy of the 12 packs. If Damien's rule falters, if the council loses confidence in his judgment, opportunities arise for those patient enough to seize them." The admission clarified things considerably for Corin, though it did little to ease the discomfort growing in his chest. He had come to Ronan seeking a way to reclaim his wounded pride, not to participate in a scheme aimed at overthrowing the entire structure of power across the 12 packs. Yet he had already traveled too far down this path to easily extract himself now, and some part of him, the same part that had rejected Lila in front of his entire pack out of fear that she might one day surpass him, whispered that perhaps this alliance offered exactly the kind of validation he had been seeking all along. "What would you need from me?" Corin asked finally. "Information, primarily," Ronan said. "You know things about this girl that the wider court does not. Details about her upbringing, her family. Any weaknesses or insecurities that might prove useful when the time comes to challenge her fitness before the council. Additionally, your testimony regarding your own bond with her, framed appropriately, could serve as valuable evidence supporting concerns about her overall stability and worthiness." Corin hesitated, memories of years spent alongside Lila surfacing uncomfortably in his mind. He remembered her quiet kindness during difficult seasons, her patience with pack members who dismissed her, the way she had never once retaliated against the small cruelties that had followed her throughout her life in Ashwood. None of these memories aligned neatly with the narrative of weakness and unsuitability that Ronan seemed eager to construct. "She is not unstable," Corin said slowly. "Weak in some ways, perhaps, uncertain of herself, but not unstable." Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Perceptions matter more than reality in matters like these," he said. "What we present to the council need not align perfectly with whatever private truths you may recall about her character. What matters is convincing enough doubt to force the king's hand." The casual dismissal of honesty in favor of strategic manipulation sat uneasily with Corin, though ambition and wounded pride ultimately outweighed whatever hesitation lingered in his conscience. "I can provide what you need," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than it had at the start of their conversation. Meanwhile, back within the walls of the Crimson Court, Nathaniel continued gathering fragments of information about the growing alliance between Ronan and Corin, piecing together a picture that grew increasingly concerning with each new detail uncovered. He brought his findings to Damien late one evening, after Lila had retired to her quarters for the night. "Ronan is more ambitious than we initially anticipated," Nathaniel reported. "Our sources suggest he is not merely seeking to embarrass Lady Marsh, but hoping to use doubts about her position to challenge her fitness to rule more broadly." Damien's expression darkened considerably at this revelation. He would risk open conflict across the 12 packs simply to advance his own ambitions? "Ronan has always believed his bloodline deserved greater standing than the ancient agreements granted him," Nathaniel said. "This situation with Lady Marsh has simply provided him an opportunity he has likely been waiting years to exploit." Damien rose from his chair, moving toward the window of his study, staring out at the darkened territory beyond the fortress walls. "What do you recommend?" "We could act preemptively," Nathaniel suggested. "Challenge Ronan's authority before he has fully consolidated his position among sympathetic council members. It would be aggressive, potentially destabilizing in its own right, but it might prevent his scheme from gaining further momentum." "No," Damien said after a long moment of consideration. "If we move against Ronan without clear justification, we risk validating exactly the narrative he is trying to construct, that I act rashly, that my judgment cannot be trusted. We need something more definitive, evidence of wrongdoing significant enough that the council cannot dismiss it as mere political rivalry." "That may take time to gather," Nathaniel warned. "Then we will take that time," Damien said. "But I want Lila protected throughout this process. If Ronan and Corin intend to target her directly, whether through rumor or something more dangerous, I will not allow her to face that threat unprepared or unaware." Nathaniel nodded, though a note of caution remained in his voice. "There is another consideration, Your Majesty. The traditional trial of the court, required of any new mate seeking full recognition as queen, remains unscheduled. Some council members have begun quietly suggesting that Lady Marsh's continued avoidance of the trial reflects her own uncertainty about her readiness for the position." Damien's jaw tightened at this news, understanding immediately the trap being constructed around Lila from multiple directions simultaneously. Delay the trial, and doubts about her legitimacy would continue mounting. Proceed with the trial too quickly, before she had adequately prepared. and she risked humiliation or worse at the hands of tests designed to challenge even experienced warriors. She will need to decide for herself when she is ready, Damien said finally. I will not force her hand on this matter, regardless of the political pressure building around us. But I fear, given everything you have described about Ronan's ambitions, that the decision may need to come sooner than either of us would prefer. As Nathaniel departed, Damien remained alone in his study long into the night, weighing the mounting threats against his mate and his rule with equal seriousness. Whatever schemes Ronan and Corin were constructing in the shadows of Thornfield territory, he understood that confronting them successfully would require more than simple political maneuvering. It would require Lila herself to step forward and prove, beyond any doubt the council or the wider court might harbor, that the moon's judgment in choosing her had been sound. The question that lingered, long after Nathaniel's departure, was whether Lila herself yet understood the strength that Damien had sensed within her from the very first moment their eyes met across that Ashwood clearing. Strength that would soon be tested in ways far more demanding than council meetings or whispered court gossip. Lila learned of the trial of the court entirely by accident, overhearing two staff members discussing it in hushed tones. As she passed through a corridor near the fortress library, she stopped, uncertain whether to interrupt, until one of the women noticed her presence and fell abruptly silent, offering a quick, uncomfortable bow before hurrying away with her companion. Curious and slightly unsettled by the sudden silence, Lila sought out Clara later that afternoon, hoping for an explanation. Clara's expression grew careful the moment Lila raised the subject, as though she had been waiting, perhaps dreading, the moment this particular topic would surface. The trial of the court is an old tradition, Clara explained, choosing her words with evident caution. Any new mate of the Alpha King, before being formally recognized as queen, must undergo a series of tests, demonstrating strength, loyalty, and command over their wolf spirit. It has not always been required in every reign, but it has never been waived for someone who arrived through a fated bond rather than lengthy courtship. Why has no one mentioned this to me before now? Lila asked, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. His Majesty likely wished to give you time to adjust to court life before burdening you with this expectation as well, Clara said. But I suspect, given how quickly whispers travel through these halls, that you were always going to learn of it eventually, whether through official channels or overheard corridor gossip. Lila pressed for further details, and Clara reluctantly described what she understood of the trial's structure: tests of physical endurance, demonstrations of loyalty to the pack and territory, and finally, most daunting of all, a ritual meant to reveal the true nature and strength of the candidate's wolf spirit before witnesses from across the 12 packs. What happens if someone fails? Lila asked quietly. Clara hesitated before answering. Failure has historically meant the bond, however fated, is deemed unworthy of formal recognition. The candidate would remain the king's companion in private, perhaps, but never his queen, never granted the full authority and protection that title carries. The weight of this information settled heavily over Lila for the remainder of the day. She thought of Victoria's pointed questions during the council meeting, of the whispered doubts she had noticed circulating among the staff and visiting nobility since her arrival. If failing this trial meant permanently confirming every doubt anyone had ever harbored about her worthiness, the stakes felt almost unbearably high. That evening, she raised the subject directly with Damien, finding him once again working late in his study, surrounded by reports and correspondence from across the territories. "Why did you not tell me about the trial yourself?" she asked, though her tone carried more confusion than accusation. Damien set down the papers he had been reviewing, guilt flickering across his features. "I intended to," he said. "I simply wanted you to have more time before facing something so demanding, especially given everything else you have already adjusted to since arriving here. I would have preferred to hear it from you, rather than overhearing servants whispering about it in a corridor," Lila said honestly. "You are right," Damien acknowledged. "I am sorry. I should have trusted you with this information sooner, rather than trying to protect you from a burden that was always going to reach you eventually." Lila appreciated the apology, though the underlying fear remained regardless of how the information had reached her. "What if I fail?" she asked, voicing the question that had haunted her thoughts since Clara's explanation earlier that day. Damien rose from his desk, crossing the room to stand before her, his expression steady, despite the concern evident in his eyes. "You will not fail," he said. "Not because failure is impossible, but because I have seen enough of your character these past weeks to know that whatever the trial demands, you possess exactly what is required to meet it. The question is whether you believe that about yourself as strongly as I do." Lila considered his words carefully, thinking of the faint stirring she had felt within her wolf during her walk through the gardens weeks earlier, thinking of the strength her father had insisted she carried whether she recognized it or not. "I do not know if I believe it yet," she admitted, "but I am willing to try to find out, rather than continue living in fear of a challenge I have not yet faced." Something shifted in Damien's expression at her words, pride and relief mingling together as he reached for her hand, an intimate gesture they had shared only rarely during her time at court, both of them still navigating the unfamiliar territory of a bond neither had chosen but both had begun, slowly, to embrace. "Then we will prepare together," he said. "Whatever Ronan and Corin are scheming in the shadows, whatever doubts linger among the council, you will face this trial having earned your place here through your own strength, not simply through the mercy of a bond that arrived without warning." Lila nodded, feeling something steady itself within her chest despite the fear still lingering beneath the surface. Whatever the trial demanded, whatever dangers Ronan and Corin's growing alliance might still pose, she resolved to meet the challenge ahead with whatever courage and strength she could summon, determined to prove, once and for all, that the moon's judgment in choosing her had never been a mistake. The morning of the trial arrived colder than Lila expected, a thin mist clinging to the fortress courtyard, where the first test would take place before an audience of council members, visiting nobility, and curious court staff who had gathered to witness whether the king's fated mate possessed the strength the position demanded. Lila stood at the edge of the courtyard, dressed in simple training clothes rather than the fine gowns she had grown accustomed to wearing, her breath visible in the cold air as she waited for the trial to formally begin. Damien stood some distance away, positioned among the council rather than beside her, tradition apparently requiring the king to observe rather than participate directly in his mate's evaluation. Victoria approached the center of the courtyard first, addressing the gathered crowd with the formal cadence of someone well-practiced in ceremonial proceedings. "The trial of the court exists to ensure that any who would stand beside our king possess the strength, loyalty, and spirit befitting such a position. Lady Marsh will face 3 tests today: physical endurance, demonstrated loyalty, and finally, the awakening ritual, meant to reveal the true nature of her wolf spirit before all assembled witnesses." Lila's heart pounded as Victoria gestured for the first test to begin. A course had been constructed across the courtyard and into the surrounding training grounds, obstacles designed to test speed, agility, and stamina in equal measure. She was not the strongest wolf present, not by any traditional measure the pack had ever valued, and she felt the weight of dozens of skeptical eyes watching her approach the starting point. "Whenever you are ready," Victoria said, though her tone carried little encouragement. Lila took a steadying breath, thinking of her father's words, of Grace's steady friendship, of Damien's unwavering conviction that she possessed exactly what this trial demanded. She thought, too, of Corin's dismissive rejection, of the humiliation that had first set her on this unlikely path, and something within her hardened at the memory, a determination she had not fully recognized in herself until this exact moment. She ran. The course proved grueling, climbing walls, crossing narrow beams suspended above training pits, sprinting through sections designed to test both speed and precision. Lila's body ached within minutes, muscles burning from exertion she had never subjected herself to during her quieter life in Ashwood. Yet she pressed forward, refusing to let exhaustion slow her pace, drawing on reserves of endurance she had not known she possessed. By the time she crossed the final obstacle, collapsing briefly to catch her breath before forcing herself upright again, murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. She had not been the fastest candidate the court had ever witnessed, Victoria informed her afterward with clinical detachment, but she had completed the course entirely, without pause or hesitation, a feat that apparently surprised several onlookers who had expected her to falter, given her reputation as an Omega from an unremarkable pack. The second test, demonstrated loyalty, took a different form entirely. Lila was led before the council, and asked a series of pointed questions about her commitment to the 12 packs, her understanding of the responsibilities that came with standing beside the king, and her willingness to prioritize the well-being of the broader wolf community above personal comfort or safety. "If a conflict arose between your personal happiness and the stability of the 12 packs," one council member asked, "which would you choose?" Lila considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not believe true happiness can exist built on instability or harm to others," she said. "If protecting the packs required personal sacrifice on my part, I would make that sacrifice, not because tradition demands it, but because I do not believe I could find genuine peace, knowing my comfort came at the expense of people who depend on the strength of this rule." The answer seemed to satisfy several council members, judging by the thoughtful nods that followed. though Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away about her own assessment of the response. The final test, the awakening ritual, took place at dusk, after the physical exhaustion of the earlier trials had already worn Lila down considerably. She was led to a circular stone platform at the center of the training grounds, ancient markings carved into its surface, said to have been used for this exact ceremony for centuries. The awakening ritual reveals the true nature of a wolf's spirit, Victoria explained, addressing the gathered crowd once more. Some candidates discover strength they did not know they possessed. Others discover the limits of what their spirit can offer. Both outcomes are valuable, as they reveal the truth the moon itself has already decided about the candidate before us. Lila stepped onto the platform, feeling an immediate shift in the air around her, similar to the pressure she had experienced the night Damien first arrived at Ashwood's moon ceremony, though far more concentrated here, drawn tightly around the ancient stones beneath her feet. "Close your eyes," Victoria instructed. "Let your wolf spirit rise freely, without restraint or fear. Whatever emerges is the truth the trial seeks to reveal." Lila closed her eyes, and for a long moment, nothing happened. She felt only the cold evening air against her skin, the exhaustion still lingering in her muscles from the earlier tests, the weight of dozens of watching eyes pressing against her concentration. Doubt began creeping into her thoughts, the old familiar fear that her wolf truly was as weak and unremarkable as Corin had always insisted. Then she thought of the pull connecting her to Damien, the warmth that had refused to fade despite weeks of uncertainty and court scrutiny. She thought of the faint stirring she had felt in the gardens weeks earlier, evidence that something within her had begun to shift since her arrival at the Crimson Court. She stopped fighting against the fear and doubt, and instead allowed herself, for the first time in years, to simply feel whatever her wolf spirit wanted to offer, without judgment or restraint. Something shifted. It began as warmth spreading from her chest outward, gentle at first, then rapidly intensifying into something far more powerful than Lila had ever experienced. Gasps rose from the watching crowd, and she opened her eyes to find a soft, golden light emanating from her skin, faint but unmistakable, pulsing in rhythm with her own racing heartbeat. "That is not possible," someone murmured from among the gathered nobility, though Lila could not identify who had spoken over the sudden rush of blood pounding in her ears. Victoria stared at her with an expression Lila had never seen the woman wear before, something between shock and disbelief, all traces of her earlier skepticism momentarily forgotten. "The Golden Awakening," Victoria said slowly, almost to herself, "has not been witnessed in this territory for over 200 years. Lila had no idea what the Golden Awakening signified, though the reactions rippling through the crowd made clear that whatever was happening to her carried significance far beyond anything she had anticipated when she stepped onto this platform only minutes earlier. The warmth continued spreading through her body, and beneath it, she felt something else entirely, an ancient, powerful presence stirring within her wolf spirit, as though something long dormant had finally been given permission to wake. Damien moved forward from among the council members, his expression a mixture of awe and fierce protectiveness, as he watched the light continue emanating from his mate. "Lila," he said softly, though his voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent courtyard, "what do you feel?" Lila struggled to find words adequate to describe the sensation building within her. Power unlike anything she had ever imagined possessing, connected somehow to something ancient and vast that stretched back further than she could comprehend. "I feel," she said slowly, "like I have been asleep my entire life, and I am only now beginning to wake up." The golden light around her intensified briefly before settling into a steady, gentle glow, and as it did, Lila felt something within her shift permanently, a fundamental change in how her wolf spirit moved and responded to her, as though years of suppressed potential had finally been unlocked all at once. Whatever weakness Corin had once perceived in her, whatever doubts the council had harbored since her arrival, all of it evaporated in the face of whatever ancient power had just revealed itself before the entire assembled court. Victoria knelt first, an act that stunned Lila even more than the golden light still lingering faintly around her own skin. One by one, the rest of the council followed, and then the gathered nobility, until the entire courtyard had lowered themselves before her in a gesture of respect Lila had never expected to witness directed at herself. "The bloodline," Victoria said, rising slowly to address the crowd once more, her voice carrying newfound reverence. "The Golden Awakening only manifests in those carrying the ancient bloodline of the first wolves, thought lost to history generations ago. Lady Marsh is not simply worthy of standing beside our king. She may be the key to power and strength this territory has not witnessed in centuries." Lila stood at the center of the platform, the golden light slowly fading from her skin, staring out at a courtyard full of people who had, only hours earlier, doubted her worthiness entirely. Whatever came next, whatever this newly discovered bloodline meant for her future, and the 12 packs she now stood ready to help protect, she understood one thing with absolute clarity as she looked toward Damien's proud, astonished expression across the courtyard. She would never again allow anyone to convince her that she was anything less than exactly what fate had always intended her to become. The celebration that followed lasted late into the night, staff and nobility alike gathering in the Great Hall to mark what many were already calling a historic occasion for the Crimson Court. Lila found herself the center of attention in a way entirely different from her arrival weeks earlier, no longer regarded with cautious skepticism but with something closer to fascinated reverence, though she noticed a few faces among the crowd that remained carefully unreadable, watching the festivities with expressions that gave away nothing of their true thoughts. She excused herself eventually, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of well-wishes and questions directed her way, seeking a quiet corner of the garden where she could finally process everything that had happened. Damien found her there within minutes, settling beside her on a stone bench beneath the same flowering trees where he had once reassured her about Victoria's early skepticism. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Overwhelmed," Lila admitted. "An hour ago I was terrified I might fail the trial entirely. Now apparently I carry some ancient bloodline that has not appeared in 2 centuries. I do not know how to hold both of those realities at once." Damien took her hand, the gesture familiar now after weeks of growing closeness between them. "You do not have to understand everything tonight," he said. "This discovery changes many things, but it does not change who you fundamentally are, the same woman who faced Victoria's questions honestly, who completed a grueling physical trial through sheer determination, who chose to trust the process even when fear urged her toward doubt." "Victoria knelt before me," Lila said, still faintly disbelieving. "An hour ago she was testing whether I even belonged here." "Victoria respects strength above almost everything else," Damien said. "What she witnessed tonight was not simply an ancient bloodline awakening. It was proof that everything I told you about your worth was true long before that golden light ever appeared. The bloodline did not create your strength, Lila. It simply revealed what was already there." Later that evening, an elder named Simon, one of the court's foremost historians, requested a brief audience to share what little remained recorded about the ancient bloodline Victoria had identified. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the caution of someone handling fragile, ancient knowledge. "The first wolves, according to the oldest surviving texts, were not divided into the 12 packs we know today," he explained. "They existed as a single unified spirit, before circumstances lost to history splintered that unity into the separate lines that eventually became our modern territories. Those who carry traces of that original bloodline are exceedingly rare, and historically, their strength has proven significant enough to reshape the balance of power across the packs entirely." "What does that mean for me, practically?" Lila asked, uncertain whether to feel more comforted or more unsettled by this explanation. "It means, Lady Marsh, that you likely possess capabilities within your wolf spirit that have not yet been tested or understood, even by yourself," Simon said. "Training and guidance will be essential in the coming months, both for your own safety and for ensuring this newfound strength serves the 12 packs, rather than becoming a danger through misunderstanding or lack of control." Lila absorbed this information carefully, understanding that whatever celebration surrounded her tonight, the true work of understanding and mastering this unexpected inheritance had only just begun. As she finally retired to her quarters late that night, exhaustion from the trial finally catching up with her, she allowed herself one small moment of quiet satisfaction before sleep claimed her entirely. Whatever Ronan and Corin had been plotting in the shadows of Thornfield territory, whatever schemes they had hoped might discredit her before the wider court, tonight had proven, beyond any doubt the council might have harbored, that she belonged exactly where fate had placed her. A week after the trial, Lila stood in a private training yard tucked away behind the fortress, watching sparks of golden light dance faintly across her fingertips as she tried, for the 3rd time that morning, to summon the sensation she had felt so overwhelmingly during the awakening ritual. Nothing happened. "You are trying too hard," said the woman standing across from her, an aging warrior named Margaret who had been specifically recalled from a distant outpost to help guide Lila through this unprecedented process. "The Golden Awakening is not something you force into existence. It responds to instinct, to emotion, to genuine need. Forcing it only pushes it further away." Lila lowered her hands, frustration mounting after days of failed attempts to consciously access whatever power had revealed itself so effortlessly during the trial. "It came so easily that night," she said. I do not understand why I cannot summon it now. During the trial, you stopped fighting against fear and simply allowed yourself to feel, Margaret explained patiently. That surrender, that willingness to be vulnerable rather than controlled, is often what triggers ancient strength like yours. Trying to command it through sheer willpower works against the very nature of what makes it powerful in the first place. Margaret had spent the past week explaining what fragments of history remained about the ancient bloodline, drawing from old texts that Simon had carefully preserved within the fortress archives. The stories described wolves capable of extraordinary feats, healing wounds that should have been fatal, communicating with other wolves across vast distances, even, in the most extreme accounts, calling upon the strength of the moon itself during moments of dire need. Whether all these stories held any truth, or whether centuries of retelling had exaggerated the original accounts beyond recognition, remained uncertain even to scholars like Simon. What if I never managed to access it again? Lila asked, voicing a fear that had grown steadily since the initial euphoria of the trial had faded into the harder reality of daily training sessions that yielded little visible progress. Then you remain exactly what you already proved yourself to be during every test before the awakening itself, Margaret said firmly. Capable, determined, worthy of your position regardless of ancient bloodlines or golden light. The power is a gift, Lila, not a requirement for your worth. The words offered some comfort, though Lila's frustration lingered as she continued her training session, attempting various exercises Margaret suggested, meditative techniques meant to encourage rather than force the connection to whatever ancient strength lived within her. Progress remained slow and inconsistent. Some days she felt faint stirrings similar to what she had experienced in the gardens weeks earlier. Other days, nothing at all, leaving her wondering whether the trial had been some singular, unrepeatable event rather than evidence of a permanent transformation. Damien visited the training yard occasionally during these sessions, though he remained careful not to interfere with Margaret's guidance, understanding that this particular journey belonged to Lila alone to navigate. He watched from the sidelines one afternoon, as Lila attempted, unsuccessfully, to summon even the faintest trace of golden light, her exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders, as she finally gave up for the day. You seem discouraged, he observed once Margaret had excused herself, leaving them alone in the training yard as dusk settled over the fortress grounds. I do not understand why this feels so difficult, Lila admitted. Everyone expects me to become this powerful figure overnight, and instead I stand here failing to summon so much as a spark most days. Perhaps everyone expecting instant mastery is the actual problem, Damien said gently, settling onto a nearby bench and gesturing for her to join him. You spent your entire life believing your wolf spirit was unremarkable, weak even. Unlearning years of that belief will not happen within a single week of training, regardless of what ancient bloodline runs through you. Lila sat beside him, appreciating the honesty in his assessment rather than empty reassurance. Corin spent years telling me I was not enough, she said quietly. I suppose some part of me still believes him, even now, even after everything the trial revealed. Then that is the real battle you are fighting, Damien said. Not against some ancient bloodline waiting to be unlocked through the right technique, but against years of believing lies that were never true in the first place. The golden light will come when you are ready, Lila, not necessarily when Margaret's exercises or the court's expectations demand it. His words settled something within her, a recognition that perhaps she had been approaching this entire process incorrectly, treating her wolf spirit as a tool to be mastered through sheer discipline, rather than a part of herself deserving patience and genuine understanding. Over the following days, she shifted her approach, spending less time forcing herself through Margaret's structured exercises and more time simply sitting quietly with her own thoughts, allowing herself to process the years of doubt Corin's rejection had cemented within her, without immediately trying to overcome them through force of will. Slowly, gradually, progress began emerging in unexpected ways. During a quiet evening walk through the gardens, Lila felt her wolf stir gently, not with the overwhelming intensity of the trial, but with a soft, steady warmth that spread naturally through her chest as she watched the sunset, painting the mountains beyond the fortress in shades of orange and gold. She did not force the sensation further, simply allowing herself to notice and appreciate it, and to her surprise, the warmth lingered longer than any of her previous attempts during structured training sessions. She reported this experience to Margaret the following morning, who listened with quiet satisfaction. That is precisely the shift I hoped you would discover, Margaret said. The ancient bloodline does not respond well to demand or force. It responds to genuine connection, to moments when you are simply present with yourself, rather than performing for an audience or striving toward some external expectation. Encouraged by this small success, Lila continued exploring this gentler approach over the following weeks, and gradually, her connection to the ancient power within her began deepening in ways that felt sustainable rather than exhausting. She discovered she could sense the emotional states of pack members within close proximity, a subtle empathic awareness that Simon's historical text described as one of the earliest documented abilities among the first wolves. She discovered, too, that her physical endurance had increased noticeably since the trial, allowing her to keep pace with trained warriors during combat exercises that would have left her utterly exhausted only months earlier. Nathaniel, who had remained cautiously reserved toward Lila since her arrival, began treating her with noticeably increased respect as reports of her progress reached him through Margaret and the training staff. "You are becoming someone this court genuinely needs," he told her during a rare private conversation, his earlier skepticism finally giving way to something resembling genuine admiration. "Whatever doubts I harbored when you first arrived, I confess they have largely dissolved watching your progress these past weeks." Lila appreciated the acknowledgement, though she remained cautious about accepting praise too readily, aware that the deeper challenge, learning to fully trust and rely on this newfound strength during moments of genuine crisis rather than controlled training exercises, still lay ahead of her. She thought often of Ronan and Corin during these weeks, aware that whatever schemes they continued constructing in the shadows of Thornfield territory would eventually surface, testing not just her theoretical strength but her capacity to protect herself and those she had come to care for at the Crimson Court. One evening, as she practiced a new meditative technique Margaret had introduced, Lila felt something shift within her, more significantly than any previous session, a wave of golden warmth spreading through her entire body, with an intensity reminiscent of the trial itself. She opened her eyes to find faint golden light once again glowing softly along her skin, summoned this time not through desperation or fear, but through quiet, deliberate connection to the strength she had spent weeks learning to trust rather than force. Margaret's expression, when she witnessed this achievement, held something close to genuine pride. "Now," Margaret said softly, "you are truly beginning to understand what you carry within you." Lila smiled, the golden light fading gently as she released the connection, satisfaction settling over her in a way that felt entirely different from the overwhelming shock of the initial trial. This time, she had summoned the power herself, deliberately, without an audience demanding proof of her worthiness. That same night, however, a disturbance near the fortress's eastern wall interrupted the quiet satisfaction of her progress. Lila woke to raised voices echoing faintly through her open window, followed by the sound of running footsteps along the corridor outside her quarters. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the source of the commotion, arriving in the courtyard just as Nathaniel emerged from the shadows near the eastern gate, gripping the arm of a struggling stranger dressed in dark, unmarked clothing. "What happened?" Lila asked, joining Damien, who had already arrived ahead of her, his expression grim in the torchlight. "A guard spotted this man attempting to scale the eastern wall," Nathaniel explained, tightening his grip as the stranger continued struggling weakly against him. "He carries no insignia identifying his territory, though his accent suggests he traveled from somewhere near Thornfield." The mention of Thornfield sent a chill through Lila, memories of Nathaniel's earlier warnings about Ronan's ambitions surfacing immediately. "What was he doing here?" she asked. "That remains to be determined," Damien said, his voice carrying an edge of controlled fury that Lila had rarely heard from him before. He turned his attention to the captured stranger. "Who sent you?" The man remained silent, his eyes darting nervously between Damien and Nathaniel, clearly weighing whether loyalty to whoever had dispatched him outweighed the fear of facing the king's wrath directly. "I know nothing," he finally muttered, though the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. "Take him to the holding cells," Damien instructed Nathaniel. "We will question him properly once he has had time to reconsider his loyalty to whoever sent him on this errand." As guards led the stranger away, Damien turned to Lila, concern evident beneath the anger still simmering in his expression. "This is likely connected to Ronan," he said quietly, once they were alone. "Whether this man intended simple reconnaissance or something more dangerous, his presence here confirms that whatever scheme Ronan and Corin have been constructing is moving beyond mere rumors and whispered doubts." "Do you think I am in danger?" Lila asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer given everything Nathaniel had shared with her over the preceding weeks. Damien's jaw tightened. "I think," he said carefully, "that Ronan understands now, as the entire court does following your trial, that discrediting you through rumor alone will prove far more difficult than he originally anticipated. Men like Ronan do not abandon their ambitions easily. They simply adjust their methods when their initial approach fails to achieve the desired result." Prot. The implication settled heavily over Lila as she considered what more direct methods Ronan might employ if whispered doubts and political maneuvering no longer served his purposes effectively. She thought of the golden light she had finally learned to summon deliberately, of the physical endurance and subtle empathic awareness she had developed over weeks of patient training, wondering whether these newfound abilities would prove sufficient if Ronan's ambitions escalated towards something more directly threatening. "I am not afraid," she said, though the words felt only partially true even as she spoke them. "Whatever Ronan is planning, I have spent too many weeks learning to trust my own strength to simply retreat into fear now." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like fierce pride mixing with evident worry in his expression. "I will not allow anything to happen to you," he said, "but I agree that retreating into fear serves no one, least of all you. We will increase security throughout the fortress, and I will have Nathaniel expand our efforts to understand exactly what Ronan and Corin are planning, before they have the opportunity to act on it fully." As they returned to their quarters that night, the earlier satisfaction of Lila's training breakthrough now tempered by the unsettling reminder of threats still gathering beyond the fortress walls, she found herself grateful, more than ever, for the weeks of patient work Margaret had guided her through. Whatever Ronan intended, whatever danger the captured stranger's presence signaled for the days ahead, Lila understood that she would face it no longer as the frightened, uncertain Omega who had first arrived at the Crimson Court, but as someone who had finally begun to trust the ancient strength quietly waiting within her all along. Lying awake later that night, she found her thoughts drifting back to the clearing in Ashwood, where this entire journey had begun, to the humiliation Corin had inflicted on her, in front of an audience that had once seemed to define the boundaries of her entire world. She realized, turning the memory over carefully in her mind, that she no longer felt the same raw pain when she thought of that night. The wound remained, a scar rather than an open injury, proof of how far she had traveled since that moment, rather than evidence of how deeply it had once broken her. She rose quietly and moved to her window, looking out over the darkened fortress grounds toward the distant mountains beyond, wondering whether Corin, wherever he now sat plotting alongside Ronan, ever thought about the woman he had rejected, or whether his ambition and wounded pride had erased any memory of the person she had once been before that night. It no longer mattered as much as it once might have. Whatever Corin believed about her, whatever schemes he and Ronan continued building in the shadows, Lila understood that her worth had never depended on his judgment in the first place, and she intended to prove that certainty beyond any possible doubt in the trials still waiting ahead of her. The captured stranger broke his silence 3 days after his failed attempt to scale the fortress wall, offering Nathaniel a confession that confirmed every fear Damien and Lila had harbored since his capture. "I was sent to observe the fortress defenses," the man admitted, his earlier defiance crumbling under the weight of prolonged questioning, and the growing realization that loyalty to Ronan offered him little protection, now that he sat imprisoned within enemy walls. Alpha Ronan wanted to know the patrol schedules, the weaknesses in the eastern approach, anything that might prove useful should more direct action become necessary. "Direct action toward what end?" Nathaniel pressed. The man hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door of the holding cell as though expecting punishment simply for revealing this much. "There is a plan," he finally said, "to disrupt the formal presentation ceremony planned for Lady Marsh before the wider court. Alpha Ronan believes that if something goes wrong during such a public event, witnessed by nobility from across all 12 packs, the resulting chaos and doubt could permanently damage both her standing and the king's authority." "What kind of disruption?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tightening with barely controlled urgency. "I do not know the full details," the man admitted. "My role was reconnaissance only, but I overheard enough to understand that Corin has agreed to play some part in whatever plan Ronan has constructed, something involving access to the ceremony that only someone with prior connection to Lady Marsh could provide." Nathaniel brought this information to Damien immediately, finding him in his study reviewing preparations for the very ceremony now under threat. Damien's expression darkened considerably as Nathaniel relayed the confession in full detail. "The formal presentation is scheduled for the end of this week," Damien said. "That gives us little time to identify exactly what Ronan intends before it potentially unfolds in front of every noble family across the 12 packs. "We could postpone the ceremony," Nathaniel suggested. "That would only confirm doubts about our confidence in Lila's readiness. Exactly the narrative Ronan has been trying to construct from the beginning," Damien said, frustration evident in his tightened jaw. "No. We proceed as planned, but we increase security dramatically, and we find a way to draw out whatever role Corin intends to play before he has the opportunity to execute it." Lila, informed of this development later that evening, felt a familiar chill settle over her despite the weeks of training and growing confidence she had built since the trial. "What do you think Corin's involvement means?" she asked, sitting across from Damien in his study as they reviewed security arrangements late into the night. "I do not know precisely," Damien admitted. "But given his history with you, his intimate knowledge of your background and habits, I suspect Ronan intends to use that familiarity somehow, perhaps to create a public confrontation or accusation that would be difficult to refute given the personal history involved." The theory settled uneasily in Lila's mind, memories of years spent alongside Corin surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. She thought of the small kindnesses he had once shown her before ambition and cruelty had reshaped their bond into something bitter and broken, wondering whether any part of the man she had once known still existed beneath whatever version of him Ronan had cultivated during their alliance. Nathaniel's investigation over the following days uncovered additional fragments of the plot, pieced together through careful questioning of the captured spy, and quiet observation of correspondence flowing between Thornfield territory and several sympathetic nobles who had expressed skepticism about Lila's position since her arrival. The picture that emerged suggested Ronan intended to have Corin appear during the formal presentation ceremony, publicly challenging Lila's legitimacy by revealing details of their prior relationship framed in ways designed to cast doubt on her character and stability. "He intends to claim I deceived him somehow," Lila said, once Nathaniel shared the full scope of what they had uncovered. "Or perhaps that I manipulated the fated bond with Damien to escape a relationship I had grown dissatisfied with." "Something along those lines," Nathaniel confirmed grimly. "The specifics remain unclear, but the intent is evident enough. Discredit your character, before an audience large and influential enough, that the resulting doubt cannot easily be dismissed or contained." Lila absorbed this information with a steadiness that surprised even herself, drawing on weeks of training and hard-won confidence, rather than the fear that might once have overwhelmed her entirely. "Then we prepare for it," she said. "If Corin intends to twist our history into some accusation against my character, I will need to be ready to answer him honestly, without flinching from whatever version of events he presents." "You do not have to face this alone," Damien said firmly. "Whatever Corin claims, I will stand beside you throughout the ceremony, and Nathaniel's security will be positioned to prevent any attempt at violence beyond simple accusation." "I appreciate that," Lila said, "but I think this particular confrontation, if it comes, needs to be something I answer for myself. Corin humiliated me once in front of an entire pack, and I let that humiliation define me for far too long afterward. If he intends to try that again in front of an even larger audience, I refuse to let fear dictate my response this time." The days leading up to the ceremony passed in a blur of preparation, security briefings, and continued training sessions with Margaret, who worked with Lila to ensure she could access her connection to the ancient bloodline reliably, should circumstances during the ceremony demand more than words to defend herself. Nathaniel positioned additional guards throughout the Great Hall where the presentation would occur, though he cautioned that overt security measures risked alerting Ronan's allies that their plot had been discovered, potentially forcing them to adjust their approach in ways that might prove even more difficult to anticipate. 2 nights before the ceremony, Lila requested a private audience with the captured spy, a decision that surprised both Damien and Nathaniel when she proposed it. "I want to understand exactly what Corin intends to say," she explained. "If I am going to face him honestly, I would rather know precisely what accusations are coming, rather than being caught entirely off guard." The spy, weakened by days of imprisonment, and clearly desperate to secure whatever leniency might still be available to him, answered her questions with surprising candor. "Corin intends to claim that you never truly loved him," the man admitted, unable to meet her eyes as he spoke. "That you used your bond with him merely as a stepping stone within Ashwood Pack, and that when the opportunity arose to claim something greater through the fated bond with the king, you abandoned him without hesitation, despite years of supposed commitment between you." The accusation, though clearly false, struck Lila with unexpected force, memories of genuine affection she had once held for Corin during their years together surfacing painfully alongside the anger she felt at this deliberate distortion of their shared history. "That is not what happened," she said quietly, more to herself than to the prisoner before her. "I know," the man said, something like genuine sympathy flickering across his exhausted features. "But truth matters little to Alpha Ronan when a convincing lie serves his purposes more effectively." Lila left the holding cells that evening with a clearer understanding of the battle awaiting her during the formal presentation, though the clarity offered little comfort against the anticipated pain of facing such a deliberate and cruel distortion of her own history in front of hundreds of watching nobles. She found Damien waiting for her outside, having insisted on accompanying her despite her initial preference to conduct the interview alone. "Are you prepared for what he intends to claim?" Damien asked gently. I do not know if prepared is the right word, Lila admitted. But I understand it now at least, and understanding feels better than facing an unknown threat entirely blind. As they walked back toward the fortress together beneath a sky heavy with clouds promising rain before morning, Lila felt the weight of the coming confrontation settling over her, alongside a steady, growing resolve that had not existed within her during those early, uncertain weeks following Corrin's initial rejection. Whatever lies he intended to tell before the assembled court, whatever schemes Ronan had constructed to exploit their shared history, she resolved to meet the challenge not as the victim Corrin had once tried to make her, but as someone who had finally learned the true measure of her own worth, regardless of what anyone else chose to believe about her. The formal presentation ceremony arrived beneath clearing skies, the great hall of the Crimson Court filled beyond capacity with nobility from every corner of the 12 packs, their fine clothing and murmured conversations, creating a hum of anticipation that filled the vast chamber long before the ceremony officially began. Lila stood at the entrance, dressed in a gown of deep blue that Clara had commissioned specifically for the occasion, her hand resting lightly in Damien's as they prepared to walk the long aisle toward the raised dais where the council waited. Remember, Damien said quietly as they began their walk, whatever happens, you do not stand alone in this. The ceremony proceeded smoothly through its initial formalities, Victoria delivering a formal address recounting the trial and the discovery of Lula's ancient bloodline, the assembled nobility offering polite applause that felt considerably warmer than the skepticism Lila had faced during her arrival months earlier. She began to hope, cautiously, that perhaps Ronan's plot had been abandoned or discovered before it could unfold, that the confession from the captured spy had perhaps disrupted whatever timeline had originally been planned. That hope shattered the moment Corrin stepped forward from among the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush that fell over the great hall. Forgive the interruption, he said, but I believe those gathered here deserve to know the full truth about the woman being presented as their future queen. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guards moved subtly closer, Nathaniel's careful positioning finally proving its worth as security tightened around the dais without triggering open alarm among the nobility. Damien's grip on Lila's hand tightened slightly, though he made no move to silence Corrin, allowing the confrontation to unfold as Lila had requested days earlier. Speak your claim, Damien said, his voice carrying the same dangerous calm Lila remembered from their first meeting in Ashwood. Corrin hesitated only briefly before continuing, though Lila noticed a tremor in his voice that had not existed during his earlier rejection months ago. Lady Marsh and I shared a bond for 3 years before its dissolution, he said. During that time, she showed little genuine affection toward our future together, treating our bond as convenient rather than meaningful. When the opportunity arose to claim something greater, through fate's intervention, she abandoned any pretense of commitment without hesitation. The accusation landed exactly as the captured spy had described, and Lila felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to such a public and deliberate distortion of their shared history. She stepped forward, releasing Damien's hand gently, understanding that this particular moment required her to stand on her own. That is not what happened, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, carrying clearly across the silent hall. I did not abandon our bond, Corrin. You rejected me, publicly, in front of our entire pack, calling me weak and unworthy before hundreds of witnesses. The bond between the king and myself formed only after that rejection had already been declared, a truth that everyone present at that ceremony can confirm. Corrin's composure faltered slightly under the directness of her response, though he pressed forward regardless. Perhaps I spoke rashly in that moment, he said, but the underlying truth remains. You never valued what we shared as deeply as you now claim. I valued it enough to endure years of quiet dismissal and unkindness without ever once considering abandoning it myself, Lila said, something firm and unshakable settling into her voice as she spoke. I valued it enough that your rejection, delivered in front of everyone I had ever known, nearly broke something within me that took months to begin healing. I do not stand before this court and claim I abandoned something I fought to preserve, far longer than you ever deserved. The hall remained utterly silent as her words settled over the assembled crowd, and Lila caught sight of several nobles exchanging glances, clearly reassessing whatever narrative Corrin had hoped to construct against her. Victoria stepped forward from the council, her expression sharp with newfound understanding. Lord Corrin, she said, addressing him with pointed formality, were you not the one who delivered a public rejection against Lady Marsh, an act rarely chosen specifically because of the humiliation it inflicts? Corin's face paled as the full weight of the court's attention shifted decisively against him. I acted rashly in a moment of frustration, he admitted, his earlier confidence crumbling entirely. And now you stand before this same court, Victoria continued, attempting to rewrite that history to suit whatever purpose brought you here today. I wonder, Lord Corin, what interest Alpha Ronan holds in seeing Lady Marsh discredited before this assembly. The mention of Ronan's name sent a visible ripple of shock through the crowd, and Corin's expression shifted from defensive to genuinely frightened as he realized the extent to which his alliance with the Thornfield Alpha had already been uncovered. Whatever plan Ronan had constructed to disrupt this ceremony had failed entirely, undone not by superior security or hidden strength, but by Lila's own willingness to face the accusation honestly, without flinching from the painful truth of what had actually transpired between them. Corin's public humiliation before the assembled court might have ended the confrontation entirely, had Ronan not chosen that exact moment to reveal his presence, striding through the Great Hall's main entrance with a small contingent of Thornfield warriors flanking him on either side. "Forgive my intrusion," Ronan said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence that fell over the gathering. "I find myself compelled to address certain accusations that appear to have been leveled against my territory." Damien stepped forward immediately, positioning himself between Ronan and Lila with an authority that left no doubt about his willingness to escalate this confrontation into something far more serious than diplomatic tension. "You are not invited to this ceremony, Ronan," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge that silenced any remaining murmurs among the nobility. "Your presence here, alongside armed warriors, suggests intentions considerably more hostile than simple observation." Ronan's expression remained maddeningly calm despite the obvious danger of his position. "I merely wish to ensure that whatever grievances my ally Corin brought before this court received a fair and complete hearing," he said. "It seems that hearing has already concluded rather unfavorably for our position, however, which leaves me little choice but to pursue other means of securing what my territory has long been owed." Before anyone could respond fully to this cryptic statement, Ronan's warriors moved with sudden, coordinated speed, several breaking away from the main group to advance directly toward Lila, while others positioned themselves to block the Great Hall's exits, trapping the assembled nobility within the chamber. Nathaniel's guards responded immediately, though the sheer chaos of the sudden movement created several tense moments before the situation stabilized into a standoff, Ronan's warriors and the Crimson Court's defenders facing each other with weapons drawn across the length of the Great Hall. "Stand down," Damien commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as Alpha King, though Ronan's warriors showed no immediate sign of compliance, awaiting instruction instead from their own Alpha, rather than a ruler they had apparently decided to defy openly. "I think not," Ronan said, stepping forward with unsettling confidence, despite being significantly outnumbered within the fortress that formed the heart of Damien's power. "I have waited years for an opportunity to correct the imbalance that ancient agreements imposed upon my bloodline. Lady Marsh's unprecedented ascension has created exactly the kind of instability I require to finally act. If I cannot discredit her through words and rumor, I will simply take what I need through more direct means." "What exactly do you intend to take?" Damien asked, though the dangerous edge in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Lady Marsh, of course," Ronan said, his gaze shifting toward Lila with calculated intensity. "A political marriage between herself and myself, secured through whatever means necessary, would grant my territory the exact standing among the 12 packs that has been denied us for generations. Your fated bond, however genuine, means little once circumstances render its continuation impossible." The audacity of the plan sent shock rippling through the assembled crowd, several nobles gasping audibly at the sheer scale of ambition Ronan had just revealed before an audience of witnesses from across every territory. Lila felt fear rising within her chest, the old instinct to shrink from confrontation threatening to resurface, but beneath it, she felt something else entirely, the steady warmth of the ancient bloodline she had spent weeks learning to trust rather than fear. "You assume I would simply allow myself to be taken," Lila said, stepping forward despite Damien's instinctive movement to keep her shielded behind him. "I am not the same woman who once shrank from confrontation in an ashwood clearing, Alpha Ronan. Whatever plan you have constructed, I do not intend to make it easy for you." Ronan's expression flickered with something between amusement and mild surprise at her defiance. "Brave words," he said, "though bravery alone will not prevent what comes next." He gave a subtle signal, and his warriors surged forward simultaneously, chaos erupting throughout the Great Hall as nobility scrambled toward whatever cover the chamber offered, while Nathaniel's guards moved to intercept Ronan's forces. Damien engaged the nearest attacker with the practiced ease of a king who had trained for combat his entire life, while Lila found herself facing two of Ronan's warriors advancing directly toward her, clearly under instruction to secure her regardless of the chaos surrounding them. She did not run. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, reaching for the connection Margaret had spent weeks teaching her to access deliberately, rather than through desperate necessity alone. The golden warmth answered immediately, spreading through her chest and down through her limbs with an intensity that startled even her, given how effortlessly it now responded compared to those early, frustrating training sessions weeks earlier. When she opened her eyes, faint golden light traced along her skin, and the two warriors advancing toward her hesitated visibly, clearly unprepared for whatever they now witnessed. Leela moved before they could recover their composure, her body responding with speed and precision that far exceeded anything she had possessed before her training began, disarming the first attacker with a swift, controlled motion before turning to face the second with newfound confidence, steadying her every movement. Across the hall, Corin watched the unfolding battle with visible horror, seemingly only now understanding the full scope of violence his alliance with Ronan had unleashed. "This was not what I agreed to," he said, though no one remained close enough to hear his protest over the chaos surrounding them. Damien, having subdued his own attacker, turned his attention toward Ronan directly, the two alphas facing each other across the ruined ceremony that had been meant to celebrate Lila's formal recognition before the court. "This ends now, Ronan," Damien said. "Whatever ambitions your bloodline harbors, they do not justify the chaos and violence you have brought into my court today. Ambitions delayed for generations do not simply disappear because you demand it," Ronan replied, though Lila noticed uncertainty creeping into his expression as he took in the scope of his failing plan, his warriors gradually being subdued or driven back by Nathaniel's superior numbers and preparation. Leela moved to stand beside Damien, the golden light still tracing faintly along her skin, evidence of strength that even she had not fully understood herself possessing only weeks earlier. "Your ambition brought you here to threaten and attack people who never wronged you," she said, addressing Ronan directly. "Whatever grievance your bloodline holds against ancient agreements, this path only proves exactly why those agreements existed in the first place." Ronan studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his eyes as he assessed the reality of his failing plan against the strength now standing before him. "Perhaps," he admitted finally, "I underestimated exactly what fate chose to place beside our king." With his warriors defeated or captured throughout the hall, Ronan found himself with little remaining option beyond surrender, or a confrontation he could not realistically win against both Damien's authority and Lila's newly revealed strength combined. He lowered his weapon slowly, signaling the few remaining warriors still resisting to stand down as well. "This is not over," Ronan said, though the words carried more desperation than genuine threat as guards moved to restrain him. "The imbalance that drove me here remains unresolved, regardless of what happens today." "Perhaps," Damien said, "but you will face whatever consequences this council deems appropriate for open rebellion against your king, rather than continuing to plot from the shadows of Thornfield territory." As guards led Ronan away in restraints, Corin remained standing alone amid the wreckage of the Great Hall, clearly recognizing that whatever alliance had once offered him a path toward reclaiming his wounded pride had led instead to his own public disgrace and Ronan's complete downfall. He made no attempt to flee or resist as guards approached to detain him as well, understanding perhaps, in this final moment, exactly how far his bitterness and ambition had carried him from the man he might once have been. Lila watched this final unraveling with a complicated mixture of relief and something close to sorrow, remembering, despite everything, the years of shared history that had once existed between herself and Corin, before ambition and cruelty had reshaped him into someone capable of orchestrating violence against people who had never wronged him. Whatever became of him now, she understood that the path forward belonged entirely to her own future, not to whatever bitterness he continued carrying from a past that no longer defined her. Damien turned to her once the chaos had fully settled, relief evident in his expression as he took in the sight of her, unharmed and standing tall despite the violence that had just unfolded around them. "You fought," he said softly, something like awe mixing with his obvious relief. "You did not hesitate, not even for a moment." "I have spent enough of my life hesitating," Lila said, the golden light finally fading from her skin as she allowed the connection to settle back into quiet dormancy. "Today, I chose to fight instead, for myself, for you, and for whatever future we are meant to build together." In the days that followed the failed uprising, the Great Hall was cleared of the damage left behind by the brief but chaotic battle, and the council convened to determine appropriate consequences for both Ronan and Corin. Victoria led the proceedings with the same formal precision she had shown during Lila's own trial weeks earlier, though her tone toward Lila now carried nothing but genuine respect, a transformation Lila still found somewhat difficult to fully absorb after months of skepticism from the same woman. Alpha Ronan's actions constitute open rebellion against the crown, Victoria announced before the assembled council. Given the severity of his conduct, including armed assault within the Crimson Court itself, this council recommends his removal from leadership of Thornfield territory, with governance transferred to a successor more aligned with the stability the 12 packs require. Damien, seated at the head of the council table, nodded in agreement. Thornfield's people should not suffer for their former Alpha's ambitions, he said. We will ensure a smooth transition of leadership that protects the well-being of those living within that territory, regardless of the consequences facing Ronan himself. Corin's case proved more complicated, given his lesser role in the actual violence, compared to Ronan's direct orchestration of the assault. After lengthy deliberation, the council determined that Corin would be stripped of his position as future beta within Ashwood Pack and permanently barred from holding any position of authority across the 12 territories, a punishment severe enough to reflect the seriousness of his betrayal, while acknowledging that he had not personally engaged in violence during the confrontation itself. Lila requested a brief private audience with Corin before his formal sentencing, a decision that surprised several council members given everything he had attempted against her. She found him in a holding chamber near the fortress's administrative wing, his earlier arrogance entirely replaced by quiet, exhausted resignation. "Why did you request to see me?" he asked, unable to fully meet her eyes as she entered. "I wanted to understand," Lila said honestly, "not to forgive what you did, but to understand how the person I once knew became capable of orchestrating something this dangerous." Corin was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that you would eventually surpass me, that your quiet strength, which I never truly appreciated while we were bonded, would eventually reveal my own inadequacies by comparison. Rejecting you felt like protecting myself from that fear. When Ronan offered a path toward reclaiming what I believed rejection had cost me, I told myself the alliance was justified, even as some part of me understood exactly how far it had carried me from decency." The admission offered Lila a measure of clarity, though it did little to soften the consequences of choices he had ultimately made regardless of whatever fear had originally motivated them. "I hope," she said finally, "that wherever you go from here, you find a way to become someone who does not need to diminish others in order to feel secure in yourself." She left the chamber without waiting for his response, understanding that whatever path Corin chose to walk from this point forward belonged entirely to him, separate from whatever future she intended to build for herself within the Crimson Court. As she made her way back through the fortress corridors, she found Damien waiting for her near the entrance to the council chambers, his expression softening the moment he saw her. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Lighter," Lila admitted, surprised by how accurately the word captured her current state. "I think I needed to face him directly, one final time, to fully release whatever weight I had still been carrying from that night in Ashwood." Damien took her hand, guiding her toward the fortress gardens where they had shared so many quiet conversations during the difficult months since her arrival. "The council has finished its deliberations," he said. "Ronan and Corin will both face their consequences, and Thornfield territory will transition toward more stable leadership under the council's guidance. Whatever threats remained against you and against the stability of the 12 packs have been resolved." "What happens now?" Lila asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer given everything that had unfolded since her arrival at the Crimson Court. Damien smiled, something warm and certain settling into his expression as he looked at her beneath the fortress garden's flowering trees. "Now," he said, "we finally celebrate everything you have earned, properly, without the shadow of scheming rivals or lingering doubt hanging over the occasion. The coronation ceremony will proceed as originally planned, and this time, nothing will interrupt it." The morning of the coronation dawned clear and bright, sunlight spilling across the Crimson Court's grand courtyard where nobility from every one of the 12 packs had gathered once more, this time without the shadow of hidden schemes or lingering doubt hanging over the occasion. Lila stood in her quarters, watching Clara make final adjustments to the ceremonial gown she would wear for the coronation, a deep gold fabric that seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light, chosen specifically to honor the ancient bloodline that had revealed itself so unexpectedly during her trial months earlier. "You seem calm," Clara observed, securing the final clasp along the gown's back. "Considering everything that has happened since your arrival here, I half expected more nervousness given the scale of today's ceremony." I think I have simply run out of room for nervousness, Lila said, examining her reflection in the same tall mirror that had once made her feel like an imposter wearing someone else's life. The woman staring back at her now felt entirely different from that uncertain arrival months earlier, though she recognized, too, that some essential part of herself, the quiet resilience that had carried her through years of dismissal in Ashwood, remained unchanged beneath everything else that had transformed since then. After facing Ronan's warriors directly, standing before an entire court to answer Corin's accusations, I think today feels almost peaceful by comparison. Clara smiled warmly, an expression that had grown considerably more common between them over the months of Lila's residence at the Crimson Court. You have earned this peace, she said. More than most who have stood in your position throughout our history. A soft knock interrupted them, and Lila's father entered, having traveled from Ashwood specifically for this occasion, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering emotion, as he took in the sight of his daughter dressed for her coronation. You look exactly like your mother did on her own wedding day, he said, his voice thick with feeling. She would be so proud of everything you have become. Lila embraced him carefully, mindful of her elaborate gown, though the gesture carried all the warmth she had missed during months separated from the only family she had left. Thank you for coming, she said. It means everything to have you here for this. I would not have missed it for anything, her father said. Grace sends her love as well, along with apologies that pack duties prevented her from making the journey herself, though she promised to visit within the month once matters in Ashwood settle. The mention of Ashwood brought a complicated mixture of feelings, memories of the pack that had once discarded her, mingling with genuine gratitude for the handful of people, her father and Grace chief among them, who had never wavered in their support despite the pack's collective judgment. Ashwood remained part of her history, shaping who she had become before fate intervened so dramatically that night in the clearing, but it no longer defined the boundaries of her world the way it once had. The ceremony itself began at midday, Lila walking the long aisle through the fortress's grand courtyard toward the raised dais where Damien waited, dressed in formal royal attire befitting the occasion. She caught sight of familiar faces throughout the crowd as she walked, Nathaniel standing near the front with something like genuine warmth in his expression, Margaret watching with quiet pride, Victoria offering a respectful nod as Lila passed her position among the council. When she reached the dais, Damien took her hand, guiding her to kneel before the assembled crowd, as tradition demanded for this final, formal step in her recognition as queen. Victoria stepped forward, holding a ceremonial crown crafted specifically to honor the ancient bloodline that had revealed itself months earlier, its design incorporating subtle golden filigree meant to reflect the light Lila had learned to summon through months of patient training. By the authority granted through ancient tradition, through the trial faced and conquered, through the bond fated by the moon itself and proven through countless trials since, Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. This council formally recognizes Lila Marsh as Queen of the 12 Packs, mate and equal to Alpha King Damien Cross. The crown settled onto Lila's head with a weight that felt entirely different from the burden she might have anticipated months earlier, when every expectation surrounding her position had felt impossible to meet. Now, having faced skepticism, betrayal, and open violence, having discovered strength within herself she had never known existed, the weight felt instead like recognition long overdue, evidence of a journey completed rather than a burden freshly imposed. She rose to her feet, and the courtyard erupted into applause, a sound entirely different from the laughter that had once accompanied her humiliation in that Ashwood clearing months earlier. This applause carried genuine respect, admiration earned through demonstrated strength rather than granted through mere circumstance or fated bond alone. Damien turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his as the crowd continued celebrating around them. "Do you remember," he said softly, meant only for her, despite the noise surrounding them, "what I told you that first night, when you asked why fate would choose someone from a small pack no one had heard of? You told me fate does not measure worth by strength," Lila said, the memory still vivid despite everything that had unfolded since, "that it measures something deeper, something none of us fully understand. I believe that more firmly now than I did even then," Damien said. "Watching you face every challenge this court presented, watching you discover strength that had always existed within you, waiting only for the right circumstances to emerge, I understand now exactly why fate chose you above anyone else it might have selected instead." Lila felt tears gathering, though these carried none of the pain that had accompanied her tears during that first devastating night. "I did not believe I deserved any of this," she admitted. "Not the bond, not the crown, certainly not the strength that revealed itself during the trial. Corin spent years convincing me I was fundamentally lacking, and some part of me believed him long after I should have known better. And now? Damien asked gently. Now, Lila said, looking out at the crowd celebrating around them, at her father's proud expression, at the council members who had once doubted her now offering genuine respect, at the fortress that had become, gradually and unexpectedly, a true home rather than simply a beautiful cage. I understand that worth was never something Corin or anyone else had the power to grant or deny in the first place. It was always mine, waiting for me to recognize it myself. The celebration continued long into the evening, feasting and dancing filling the great hall that had witnessed both violence and triumph within the same season, transformed now into a space of genuine joy rather than lingering danger. Lila moved through the gathering with an ease that would have seemed impossible during those early, overwhelming weeks following her arrival. No longer the uncertain Omega who had stumbled into this world through fate's sudden intervention, but a queen who had earned her place through demonstrated strength, resilience, and unwavering honesty in the face of every challenge presented to her. Late that night, after the celebrations had finally quieted and most of the gathered nobility had retired to their chambers, Lila stood alone on the balcony of her quarters, the same balcony where she had first gazed out at unfamiliar mountains months earlier, uncertain whether she would ever find her footing in this strange new world. The mountains remained the same, but everything else had transformed entirely, including the woman standing before them now. Damien joined her quietly, wrapping his arms around her as they both looked out at the moonlit landscape stretching endlessly before them. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Lila considered the question seriously before answering, thinking of the humiliation that had first set this entire journey into motion, of the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied nearly every step since, of the strength and worth she had discovered within herself, only through facing challenges she had never anticipated needing to overcome. "None," she said finally. "Corin's rejection was the cruelest moment of my life, but it led me here, to strength I never knew I possessed, to a bond more genuine than anything I experienced during those years I spent believing I was fortunate simply to be tolerated." "You were never fortunate to simply be tolerated," Damien said firmly. "You deserve to be treasured all along." Lila leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of the bond that had transformed her entire existence since that devastating night in Ashwood, understanding finally, completely, that whatever the future held for her, and the 12 packs she now stood ready to help guide, she would face it having already proven, beyond any doubt, exactly the strength and worth that fate had recognized in her, from the very first moment their eyes met, across that fateful clearing. The moon hung full and bright above the Crimson Court that night, the same moon that had once orchestrated her rejection and her unexpected elevation within the same devastating hour, now simply bearing witness to a queen who had claimed her place not through fate alone, but through every difficult, courageous choice she had made in the months since that fate first revealed itself. Several weeks later, Grace finally made the journey from Ashwood, arriving at the Crimson Court with a mixture of awe and delighted disbelief at the transformation her closest friend had undergone since that terrible night in the clearing. "I still cannot quite believe it," Grace admitted, walking with Lila through the same fortress gardens where so much of her growth had taken place. "The last time I saw you, you were shattered, uncertain whether you would even survive the humiliation Corin inflicted. Now look at you, Queen of the 12 Packs, wielding power that has not appeared in this territory for centuries." "I do not think I truly believed it myself, not fully, until fairly recently," Lila admitted, guiding Grace toward a bench overlooking the mountains that had become such a familiar sight during her months of residence here. "There were so many moments when I nearly convinced myself that Corin had been right about me all along, that whatever fate had chosen was simply a mistake waiting to be corrected. And now?" Grace asked, echoing the same question Damien had posed on the night of the coronation. "Now I understand that mistakes do not undo themselves through hundreds of witnesses kneeling before ancient bloodlines," Lila said, a small smile touching her lips. "Whatever fate decided that night, I have spent every day since proving it was never a mistake in the first place, through my own choices rather than simply through inherited strength." Grace squeezed her hand warmly. "Your father tells everyone in Ashwood about your coronation whenever anyone will listen," she said. "Even those who once whispered about your rejection now speak of you with genuine pride. Funny how quickly people's memories shift once someone proves them entirely wrong about their judgments." Lila laughed softly at this, though the observation carried a bittersweet edge given everything the same pack had once put her through. "I do not hold it against them," she said. "Everyone believes what seems obvious at the time, and I suppose being wrong about someone's worth is a mistake more common than any of us would like to admit." Their conversation continued through the afternoon, catching up on months of separation, Grace sharing news from Ashwood, while Lila described the challenges and triumphs that had shaped her transformation since arriving at the Crimson Court. As evening approached, Damien joined them briefly, greeting Grace warmly, before excusing himself to attend to matters of governance that continued regardless of coronations or celebrations. "He seems different than I expected," Grace observed once he had departed. "Kinder, somehow, than the stories about Alpha Kings usually suggest." "He has been patient with me since the very beginning," Lila said. "Even when I did not fully trust the bond fate had thrust upon us. Even when the council doubted my readiness. Even when Corin and Ronan threatened everything we were building together. I do not think I would have found my way to this place. To who I have become, without that patience guiding me through the hardest moments." As the sun began setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold that mirrored the ancient bloodline now flowing steadily through Lila's veins, she found herself reflecting on the impossible journey that had carried her, from a devastated Omega, rejected before an entire pack, to a queen who had earned her place through courage, honesty, and hard-won strength rather than fate's intervention alone. Whatever challenges still awaited her in the years ahead as she helped guide the 12 packs alongside Damien, she understood now, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she possessed exactly the strength required to meet them, not because an ancient bloodline had revealed itself during a single dramatic trial, but because she had proven, time and again, through every difficult choice along the way, that she had never truly been the weak, unworthy Omega Corin once claimed her to be. She was, and had always been, exactly enough.